Section 9 of Tales of the Jazz Age by F. Scott Fitzgerald. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Tarquin of Cheapside. Running footsteps, light, soft-soled shoes made of curious leathery cloth brought from Ceylon setting the pace. Thick flowing boots, 2 pairs, dark blue and gilt, reflecting the moonlight in blunt gleams and splotches, following a stone's throw behind. Soft shoes flashes through a patch of moonlight, then darts into a blind labyrinth of alleys and becomes only an intermittent scuffle ahead somewhere in the enfolding darkness. In go flowing boots, with short swords lurching and long plumes awry, finding a breath to curse God and the black lanes of London. Soft shoes leaps a shadowy gate and crackles through a hedgerow. Flowing boots leap the gate and crackles through the hedgerow, and there, startlingly, is the watch ahead. 2 murderous pikemen of ferocious cast of mouth, acquired in Holland and the Spanish marches. But there is no cry for help. The pursued does not fall panting at the feet of the watch, clutching a purse, neither do the pursuers raise a hue and cry. Soft shoes goes by in a rush of swift air. The watch curse and hesitate, glance after the fugitive, and then spread their pikes grimly across the road and wait for flowing boots. Darkness, like a great hand, cuts off the even flow of the moon. The hand moves off the moon, whose pale caress finds again the eaves and lintels, and the watch, wounded and tumbled in the dust. Up the street one of the flowing boots leaves a black trail of spots until he binds himself clumsily as he runs, with fine lace caught from his throat. It was no affair for the watch. Satan was at large tonight, and Satan seemed to be he who appeared dimly in front, heel over gate, knee over fence. Moreover, the adversary was obviously travelling near home, or at least in that section of London consecrated to his coarser whims, for the street narrowed like a road in a picture, and the houses bent over further and further, cooping in natural ambushes suitable for murder and its historic sister, sudden death. Down long and sinuous lanes twisted the hunted and the harriers, always in and out of the moon in a perpetual queen's move over a checkerboard of glints and patches. Ahead, the quarry, minus his leather jerkin now and half blinded by drips of sweat, had taken to scanning his ground desperately on both sides. As a result, he suddenly slowed short, and retracing his steps a bit, scooted up an alley so dark that it seemed that here sun and moon had been in eclipse since the last glacier slipped roaring over the earth. 200 yards down he stopped and crammed himself into a niche in the wall, where he huddled and panted silently, a grotesque god without bulk or outline in the gloom. Flowing boots, 2 pairs, drew near, came up, went by, halted 20 yards beyond him, and spoke in deep-lunged, scanty whispers. "I was attuned to that scuffle. It stopped." "Within 20 paces." "He's hid." "Stay together now and we'll cut him up." The voice faded into a low crunch of boot, nor did Soft Shoes wait to hear more. He sprang in 3 leaps across the alley, where he bounded up, flapped for a moment on the top of the wall like a huge bird, and disappeared, gulped down by the hungry night at a mouthful. 2. He read at wine, he read in bed, he read aloud had he breath. His every thought was with the dead, and so he read himself to death. Any visitor to the old James I graveyard near Pete's Hill may spell out this bit of doggerel, undoubtedly one of the worst recorded of an Elizabethan, on the tomb of Wessel Castor. This death of his, says the antiquary, occurred when he was 37. But as this story is concerned with the night of a certain chase through the darkness, we find him still alive, still reading. His eyes were somewhat dim, his stomach somewhat obvious. He was a misbuilt man and indolent. Oh, heavens! But an era is an era, and in the reign of Elizabeth, by the grace of Luther, Queen of England, no man could help but catch the spirit of enthusiasm. Every loft in Cheapside published its magnum folium, or magazine, of its new blank verse. The Cheapside Players would produce anything on sight as long as it got away from those reactionary miracle plays. And the English Bible had run through 7 very large printings in as many months. So Wessel Caxter, who in his youth had gone to sea, was now a reader of all on which he could lay his hands. He read manuscripts in holy friendship. He dined rotten poets. He loitered about the shops where the Magnafolia were printed, and he listened tolerantly while the young playwrights wrangled and bickered among themselves and behind each other's backs made bitter and malicious charges of plagiarism or anything else they could think of. To night he had a book, a piece of work which, though inordinately versed, contained, he thought, some rather excellent political satire. The Fairy Queen by Edmund Spenser lay before him under the tremulous candlelight. He had ploughed through a canto. He was beginning another. The Legend of Britomartis or of Chastity. It falls me here to write of chastity, the fairest virtue far above the rest. A sudden rush of feet on the stairs, a rusty swing open of the thin door, and a man thrust himself into the room, a man without a jerkin, panting, sobbing, on the verge of collapse. "Wessel!" Words choked him. "Stick me away somewhere. Love of Our Lady!" Caxter rose, carefully closing his book, and bolted the door in some concern. "I'm pursued!" cried out Soft Shoes. "I vow there's two short-witted blades trying to make me into mincemeat, and near succeeding. They saw me hop the back wall." "It would need," said Wessel, looking at him curiously, "several battalions armed with blunderbusses and 2 or 3 armadas to keep you reasonably secure from the revenges of the world." Soft Shoes smiled with satisfaction. His sobbing gasps were giving way to quick, precise breathing. His hunted air had faded to a faintly perturbed irony. "I feel a little surprise," continued Wessel. "They were 2 such dreary apes." "Making a total of 3. "Only 2 unless you stick me away. Man, come alive, they'll be on the stairs in a spark's age." Wessel took a dismantled pikestaff from the corner, and raising it to the high ceiling, dislodged a rough trapdoor opening into a garret above. "There's no ladder." He moved a bench under the trap, upon which Soft Shoes mounted, crouched, hesitated, crouched again, and then leaped amazingly upward. He caught at the edge of the aperture and swung back and forth for a moment, shifting his hold, finally doubled up and disappeared into the darkness above. There was a scurry, a migration of rats as the trapdoor was replaced. Silence. Wessel returned to his reading table, opened to the Legend of Britomartis or of Chastity, and waited. Almost a minute later there was a scramble on the stairs and an intolerable hammering at the door. Wessel sighed and, picking up his candle, rose. "Who's there?" "Open the door." "Who's there?" An aching blow frightened the frail wood, splintered it around the edge. Wessel opened it a scarce 3 inches and held the candle high. His was to play the timorous, the super-respectable citizen disgracefully disturbed. "1 small hour of the night for rest. Is that too much to ask from every brawler and—" "Quiet, gossip! Have you seen a perspiring fellow?" The shadows of 2 gallants fell in immense wavering outlines over the narrow stairs. By the light Wessel scrutinized them closely. Gentlemen they were, hastily but richly dressed, one of them wounded severely in the hand, both radiating a sort of furious horror. Waving aside Wessel's ready miscomprehension, they pushed by him into the room and with their swords went through the business of poking carefully into all suspected dark spots in the room, further extending their search to Wessel's bedchamber. "Is he hid here?" demanded the wounded man fiercely. "Is who here?" "Any man but you." "Only 2 others that I know of." For a second Wessel feared that he had been too damned funny, for the gallants made as though to prick him through. "I heard a man on the stairs," he said hastily. "Full 5 minutes ago it was. He most certainly failed to come up." He went on to explain his absorption in the Fairy Queen, but for the moment at least his visitors, like the great saints, were anaesthetic to culture. "What's been done?" enquired Wessel. "Violence," said the man with the wounded hand. Wessel noticed that his eyes were quite wild. "My own sister! Oh, Christ in heaven, give us this man!" Wessel winced. "Who is the man?" "God's word, we know not even that. What's that trap up there?" he added suddenly. "It's nailed down. It's not been used for years." He thought of the pole in the corner and quailed in his belly, but the utter despair of the 2 men dulled their astuteness. "It would take a ladder for anyone not a tumbler," said the wounded man listlessly. His companion broke into hysterical laughter. "A tumbler! Oh, a tumbler! Oh!" Wessel stared at them in wonder.
"That appeals to my most tragic humour," cried the man. "That no one, oh, no one, could get up there but a tumbler."
The gallant with the wounded hand snapped his good fingers impatiently.
"We must go next door, and then on."
Helplessly they went as two walking under a dark and storm swept sky. Wessel closed and bolted the door and stood a moment by it, frowning in pity. A low breathed "Ha!" made him look up. Soft Shoes had already raised the trap and was looking down into the room, his rather elfish face squeezed into a grimace, half of distaste, half of sardonic amusement.
"They take off their heads with their helmets," he remarked in a whisper. "But as for you and me, Wessel, we are two cunning men."
"Now you be cursed!" cried Wessel vehemently. "I know you for a dog, but when I hear even the half of a tale like this, I know you for such a dirty cur that I am minded to club your skull." Soft Shoes stared at him, blinking.
"At all events," he replied finally, "I find dignity impossible in this position."
With this he let his body through the trap, hung for an instant, and dropped the 7 feet to the floor.
"There was a rat considering my ear with the air of a gourmet," he continued, dusting his hands on his breeches. "I told him in the rat's peculiar idiom that I was deadly poison, so he took himself off."
"Let's hear of this night's lechery," insisted Wessel angrily. Soft Shoes touched his thumb to his nose and wiggled the fingers derisively at Wessel. "Straight gammon," muttered Wessel.
"Have you any paper?"
demanded Soft Shoes irrelevantly, and then rudely added,
"Or can you write?"
"Why should I give you paper?"
"You wanted to hear of the night's entertainment. So you shall, an you give me pen, ink, a sheaf of paper, and a room to myself."
Wessel hesitated. "Get out," he said finally.
"As you will, yet you have missed a most intriguing story."
Wessel wavered. He was soft as taffy, that man. Gave in. Soft Shoes went into the adjoining room with the begrudged writing materials and precisely closed the door. Wessel grunted and returned to the Fairy Queen. So silence came once more upon the house. 3. 3 o'clock went into 4. The room paled, the dark outside was shot through with damp and chill, and Wessel, cupping his brain in his hands, bent low over his table, tracing through the pattern of knights and fairies and the harrowing distresses of many girls. There were dragons chortling along the narrow street outside. When the sleepy armourer's boy began his work at 5:30, the heavy clink and clank of plate and linked mail swelled to the echo of a marching cavalcade. A fog shut down at the first flare of dawn, and the room was greyish yellow at 6 when Wessel tiptoed to his cupboard bedchamber and pulled open the door. His guest turned on him a face pale as parchment, in which two distraught eyes burned like great red letters. He had drawn a chair close to Wessel's prie-dieu, which he was using as a desk, and on it was an amazing stack of closely written pages. With a long sigh Wessel withdrew and returned to his siren, calling himself fool for not claiming his bed here at dawn. The dump of boots outside, the croaking of old beldames from attic to attic, the dull murmur of morning unnerved him, and, dozing, he slumped in his chair, his brain, overladen with sound and colour, working intolerably over the imagery that stacked it. In this restless dream of his he was one of 1,000 groaning bodies crushed near the sun, a helpless bridge for the strong-eyed Apollo. The dream tore at him, scraped along his mind like a ragged knife. When a hot hand touched his shoulder he awoke with what was nearly a scream to find the fog thick in the room and his guest, a grey ghost of misty stuff, beside him with a pile of paper in his hand.
"It should be a most intriguing tale, I believe, though it requires some going over. May I ask you to lock it away, and in God's name let me sleep?"
He waited for no answer, but thrust the pile at Wessel and literally poured himself like stuff from a suddenly inverted bottle upon a couch in the corner, slept, with his breathing regular, but his brow wrinkled in a curious and somewhat uncanny manner. Wessel yawned sleepily, and glancing at the scrawled, uncertain first page, he began reading aloud very softly. "The Rape of Lucrece. From the besieged Ardea, all in post, borne by the trustless wings of false desire, lust-breathing Tarquin leaves the Roman host." End of section 9. Read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California, shaggybark.blogspot.com. Tales of the Jazz Age by F. Scott Fitzgerald. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. O Russet Witch. Merlin Grainger was employed by the Moonlight Quill bookshop, which you may have visited, just around the corner from the Ritz Carlton on 47th Street. The Moonlight Quill is, or rather was, a very romantic little store, considered radical and admitted dark. It was spotted interiorly with red and orange posters of breathless exotic intent, and lit no less by the shiny reflecting bindings of special editions than by the great squat lamp of crimson satin that, lighted through all the day, swung overhead. It was truly a mellow bookshop. The words Moonlight Quill were worked over the door in a sort of serpentine embroidery. The windows seemed always full of something that had passed the literary censors with little to spare. Volumes with covers of deep orange which offer their titles on little white paper squares. And over all there was the smell of the musk, which the clever, inscrutable Mr. Moonlight Quill ordered to be sprinkled about, the smell half of a curiosity shop in Dickens' London, and half of a coffee house on the warm shores of the Bosphorus. From 9 until 5:30 Merlin Grainger asked bored old ladies in black and young men with dark circles under their eyes if they cared for this fellow, or were interested in first editions. Did they buy novels with Arabs on the cover, or books which gave Shakespeare's newest sonnets as dictated psychically to Miss Sutton of South Dakota? He sniffed. As a matter of fact, his own taste ran to these latter. But as an employee of the Moonlight Quill, he assumed for the working day the attitude of a disillusioned connoisseur. After he had crawled over the window display to pull down the front shade at 5:30 every afternoon, and said good bye to the mysterious Mr. Moonlight Quill and the lady clerk, Miss McCracken, and the lady stenographer, Miss Masters, he went home to the girl, Caroline. He did not eat supper with Caroline. It is unbelievable that Caroline would have considered eating off his bureau, with the collar buttons dangerously near the cottage cheese, and the ends of Merlin's necktie just missing his glass of milk. He had never asked her to eat with him. He ate alone. He went into Bregdort's Delicatessen on 6th Avenue and bought a box of crackers, a tube of anchovy paste, and some oranges, or else a little jar of sausages and some potato salad and a bottled soft drink, and with these in a brown package he went to his room at 50 something West 58th Street and ate his supper and saw Caroline. Caroline was a very young and gay person who lived with some older lady and was possibly 19. She was like a ghost in that she never existed until evening. She sprang into life when the lights went on in her apartment at about 6, and she disappeared, at the latest, about midnight. Her apartment was a nice one, in a nice building, with a white stone front, opposite the south side of Central Park. The back of her apartment faced the single window of the single room occupied by the single Mr. Grainger. He called her Caroline because there was a picture that looked like her on the jacket of a book of that name down at the Moonlight Quill. Now, Merlin Grainger was a thin young man of 25, with dark hair and no moustache or beard or anything like that, but Caroline was dazzling and light, with a shimmering morass of russet waves to take the place of hair, and the sort of features that remind you of kisses, the sort of features you thought belonged to your first love, but no, when you come across an old picture, didn't. She dressed in pink or blue usually, but of late she had sometimes put on a slender black gown that was evidently her especial pride, for whenever she wore it she would stand regarding a certain place on the wall, which Merlin thought must be a mirror. She sat usually in the profile chair near the window, but sometimes honored the chaise lounge by the lamp, and often she leaned way back and smoked a cigarette with posturings of her arms and hands that Merlin considered very graceful. At another time she had come to the window and stood in it, magnificently, and looked out because the moon had lost its way and was dripping the strangest and most transforming brilliance into the areaway between, turning the motif of ash cans and clotheslines into a vivid impressionism of silver casks and giant gossamer cobwebs. Merlin was sitting in plain sight, eating cottage cheese with sugar and milk on it, and so quickly did he reach out for the window cord that he tipped the cottage cheese into his lap with his free hand, and the milk was cold and the sugar made spots on his trousers, and he was sure that she had seen him after all. Sometimes there were callers, men in dinner coats, who stood and bowed, hat in hand and coat on arm, as they talked to Caroline; then bowed some more and followed her out of the light, obviously bound for a play or for a dance. Other young men came and sat and smoked cigarettes and seemed trying to tell Caroline something, she sitting either in the profile chair and watching them with eager intentness, or else in the chaise lounge by the lamp, looking very lovely and youthfully inscrutable indeed. Merlin enjoyed these calls. Some of the men he approved, others won only his grudging toleration, one or two he loathed. Especially the most frequent caller, a man with black hair and a black goatee and a pitch dark soul, who seemed to Merlin vaguely familiar, but whom he was never quite able to recognize. Now, Merlin's whole life was not bound up with this romance he had constructed. It was not the happiest hour of his day. He never arrived in time to rescue Caroline from clutches, nor did he even marry her. A much stranger thing happened than any of these, and it is this strange thing that will presently be set down here. It began one October afternoon when she walked briskly into the mellow interior of the Moonlight Quill. It was a dark afternoon, threatening rain and the end of the world, and done in that particularly gloomy grey in which only New York afternoons indulge. A breeze was crying down the streets, whisking along battered newspapers and pieces of things, and little lights were pricking out all the windows. It was so desolate that one was sorry for the tops of skyscrapers lost up there in the dark green grey heaven, and felt that now surely the farce was to close, and presently all the buildings would collapse like card houses, and pile up in a dusty sardonic heap upon all the millions who presumed to wind in and out of them. At least these were the sort of musings that lay heavily upon the soul of Merlin Grainger, as he stood by the window putting a dozen books back in a row after a cyclonic visit by a lady with ermine trimmings. He looked out of the window full of the most distressing thoughts, of the early novels of H.G. Wells, of the Boot Genesis, of how Thomas Edison had said that in 30 years there would be no dwelling houses upon the island, but only a vast and turbulent bazaar, and then he set the last book right side up, turned, and Caroline walked coolly into the shop. She was dressed in a jaunty but conventional walking costume. He remembered this when he thought about it later. Her skirt was plaid, pleated like a concertina. Her jacket was soft but brisk tan. Her shoes and spats were brown, and her hat, small and trim, completed her like the top of a very expensive and beautifully filled candy box. Merlin, breathless and startled, advanced nervously toward her. "Good afternoon," he said, and then stopped. Why, he did not know, except that it came to him that something very portentous in his life was about to occur, and that it would need no furbishing but silence, and the proper amount of expectant attention. And in that minute, before the thing began to happen, he had the sense of a breathless second hanging suspended in time. He saw, through the glass partition that bounded off the little office, the malevolent conical head of his employer, Mr. Moonlight Quill, bent over his correspondence. He saw Miss McCracken and Miss Masters as two patches of hair drooping over piles of paper. He saw the crimson lamp overhead, and noticed with a touch of pleasure how really pleasant and romantic it made the bookstore seem. Then the thing happened, or rather it began to happen. Caroline picked up a volume of poems lying loose upon a pile, fingered it absently with her slender white hand, and suddenly, with an easy gesture, tossed it upward toward the ceiling, where it disappeared in the crimson lamp and lodged there, seen through the illuminated silk as a dark, bulging rectangle. This pleased her. She broke into young, contagious laughter, in which Merlin found himself presently joining. "It stayed up!" she cried merrily. "It stayed up, didn't it?" To both of them this seemed the height of brilliant absurdity. Their laughter mingled, filled the bookshop, and Merlin was glad to find that her voice was rich and full of sorcery. "Try another," he found himself suggesting. "Try a red one." At this her laughter increased, and she had to rest her hands upon the stack to steady herself. "Try another," she managed to articulate between spasms of mirth. "Ho! Oh, golly, try another." "Try two." "Yes, try two. Oh, I'll choke if I don't stop laughing. Here it goes." Suiting her action to the word, she picked up a red book and sent it in a gentle hyperbola toward the ceiling, where it sank into the lamp beside the first. It was a few minutes before either of them could do more than rock back and forth in helpless glee. But then, by mutual agreement, they took up the sport anew, this time in unison. Merlin seized a large, specially bound French classic and whirled it upward. Applauding his own accuracy, he took a best seller in one hand and a book on barnacles in the other and waited breathlessly while she made her shot. Then the business waxed fast and furious. Sometimes they alternated and, watching, he found how supple she was in every movement. Sometimes one of them made shot after shot, picking up the nearest book, sending it off, merely taking time to follow it with a glance before reaching for another. Within 3 minutes they had cleared the little place on the table, and the lamp of crimson satin was so bulging with books that it was near breaking.
"Silly game, basketball," she cried scornfully as a book left her hand. "High school girls play it in hideous bloomers."
"Idiotic," he agreed. She paused in the act of tossing a book and replaced it suddenly in its position on the table.
"I think we've got room to sit down now," she said gravely.
They had. They had cleared an ample space for two. With a faint touch of nervousness, Merlin glanced toward Mr. Moonlight Quill's glass partition, but the three heads were still bent earnestly over their work, and it was evident that they had not seen what had gone on in the shop. So when Caroline put her hands on the table and hoisted herself up, Merlin calmly imitated her, and they sat side by side looking very earnestly at each other.
"I had to see you,"
she began, with a rather pathetic expression in her brown eyes.
"I know." "It was that last time," she continued, her voice trembling a little, though she tried to keep it steady. "I was frightened. I don't like you to eat off the dresser, so I'm afraid you'll swallow a collar button."
"I did once, almost," he confessed reluctantly.
"But it's not so easy, you know. I mean, you can swallow the flat part easy enough, or else the other part, that is, separately. But for a whole collar button you'd have to have a specially made throat."
He was astonishing himself by the debonair appropriateness of his remarks. Words seemed for the first time in his life to run at him, shrieking to be used, gathering themselves into carefully arranged squads and platoons, and being presented to him by punctilious adjutants of paragraphs.
"That's what scared me," she said. "I knew you had to have a specially made throat, and I knew, at least I felt sure, that you didn't have one."
He nodded frankly. "I haven't. It costs money to have one, more money, unfortunately, than I possess." He felt no shame in saying this, rather a delight in making the admission. He knew that nothing he could say or do would be beyond her comprehension, least of all his poverty and the practical impossibility of ever extricating himself from it. Caroline looked down at her wrist watch, and with a little cry slid from the table to her feet.
"It's after 5," she cried. "I didn't realize. I have to be at the Ritz at 5:30. Let's hurry and get this done. I've got a bet on it."
With one accord they set to work. Caroline began the matter by seizing a book on insects and sending it whizzing and finally crashing through the glass partition that housed Mr. Moonlight Quill. The proprietor glanced up with a wild look, brushed a few pieces of glass from his desk, and went on with his letters. Miss McCracken gave no sign of having heard. Only Miss Masters started and gave a little frightened scream before she bent to her task again. But to Merlin and Caroline it didn't matter. In a perfect orgy of energy they were hurling book after book in all directions, until sometimes 3 or 4 were in the air at once, smashing against shelves, cracking the glass of pictures on the walls, falling in bruised and torn heaps upon the floor. It was fortunate that no customers happened to come in, for it is certain they would never have come in again. The noise was too tremendous, a noise of smashing and ripping and tearing, mixed now and then with the tinkling of glass, the quick breathing of the two throwers, and the intermittent outbursts of laughter to which both of them periodically surrendered. At 5:30 Caroline tossed a last book at the lamp and gave the final impetus to the load it carried. The weakened silk tore and dropped its cargo in one vast splattering of white and colour to the already littered floor. Then with a sigh of relief she turned to Merlin and held out her hand.
"Good bye,"
she said simply. "Are you going?" He knew she was. His question was simply a lingering wile to detain her and extract for another moment that dazzling essence of light he drew from her presence, to continue his enormous satisfaction in her features, which were like kisses, and, he thought, like the features of a girl he had known back in 1910. For a minute he pressed the softness of her hand, then she smiled and withdrew it, and, before he could spring to open the door, she had done it herself and was gone out into the turbid and ominous twilight that brooded narrowly over 47th Street. I would like to tell you how Merlin, having seen how beauty regards the wisdom of the years, walked into the little partition of Mr. Moonlight Quill and gave up his job then and there, thence issuing out into the street a much finer and nobler and increasingly ironic man. But the truth is much more commonplace. Merlin Grainger stood up and surveyed the wreck of the bookshop, the ruined volumes, the torn silk remnants of the once beautiful crimson lamp, the crystalline sprinkling of broken glass which lay in iridescent dust over the whole interior, and then he went to a corner where the broom was kept and began cleaning up and rearranging and, as far as he was able, restoring the shop to its former condition. He found that, though some few of the books were uninjured, most of them had suffered in varying extents. The backs were off some, the pages were torn from others, still others were just slightly cracked in the front, which, as all careless book returners know, makes a book unsaleable and therefore second hand. Nevertheless, by 6 o'clock he had done much to repair the damage. He had returned the books to their original places, swept the floor, and put new lights in the sockets overhead. The red shade itself was ruined beyond redemption, and Merlin thought in some trepidation that the money to replace it might have to come out of his salary. At 6, therefore, having done the best he could, he crawled over the front window display to pull down the blind. As he was treading delicately back, he saw Mr. Moonlight Quill rise from his desk, put on his overcoat and hat, and emerge into the shop. He nodded mysteriously at Merlin and went toward the door. With his hand on the knob, he paused, turned around, and in a voice curiously compounded of ferocity and uncertainty, he said: "If that girl comes in here again, you tell her to behave." With that he opened the door, drowning Merlin's meek "Yes, sir" in its creak, and went out. Merlin stood there for a moment, deciding wisely not to worry about what was for the present only a possible futurity. And then he went into the back of the shop and invited Miss Masters to have supper with him at Poolpot's French Restaurant, where one could still obtain red wine at dinner, despite the great federal government. Miss Masters accepted. "Wine makes me feel all tingly," she said. Merlin laughed inwardly as he compared her to Caroline, or rather as he didn't compare her. There was no comparison. 2. Mr. Moonlight Quill, mysterious, exotic, and oriental in temperament, was nevertheless a man of decision, and it was with decision that he approached the problem of his wrecked shop. Unless he should make an outlay equal to the original cost of his entire stock, a step which for certain private reasons he did not wish to take, it would be impossible for him to continue in business with the Moonlight Quill as before. There was but one thing to do. He promptly turned his establishment from an up-to-the-minute bookstore into a second-hand bookshop. The damaged books were marked down from 25 to 50%. The name over the door, whose serpentine embroidery had once shone so insolently bright, was allowed to grow dim and take on the indescribably vague colour of old paint. And, having a strong penchant for ceremonial, the proprietor went so far as to buy 2 skull caps of shoddy red felt, one for himself and one for his clerk, Merlin Grainger. Moreover, he let his goatee grow until it resembled the tail feathers of an ancient sparrow, and substituted for a once dapper business suit a reverence-inspiring affair of shiny alpaca. In fact, within a year after Caroline's catastrophic visit to the bookstore, the only thing in it that preserved any resemblance of being up to date was Miss Masters. Miss McCracken had followed in the footsteps of Mr. Moonlight Quill and become an intolerable dowd. For Merlin, too, from a feeling compounded of loyalty and listlessness, had let his exterior take on the semblance of a deserted garden. He accepted the red felt skull cap as a symbol of his decay. Always a young man known as a pusher he had been, since the day of his graduation from the manual training department of a New York high school, an inveterate brusher of clothes, hair, teeth, and even eyebrows, and had learned the value of laying all his clean socks toe upon toe and heel upon heel in a certain drawer of his bureau which would be known as the sock drawer. These things, he felt, had won him his place in the greatest splendour of the Moonlight Quill. It was due to them that he was not still making chests useful for keeping things, as he was taught with breathless practicality in high school, and selling them to whoever had use of such chests, possibly undertakers. Nevertheless, when the progressive Moonlight Quill became the retrogressive Moonlight Quill, he preferred to sink with it, and so took to letting his suits gather undisturbed the wispy burdens of the air, and to throwing his socks indiscriminately into the shirt drawer, the underwear drawer, and even into no drawer at all. It was not uncommon in his new carelessness to let many of his clean clothes go directly back into the laundry without having ever been worn, a common eccentricity of impoverished bachelors. And this in the face of his favourite magazines, which at that time were fairly staggering with articles by successful authors against the frightful impudence of the condemned poor, such as the buying of wearable shirts and nice cuts of meat, and the fact that they preferred good investments in personal jewellery to respectable ones in 4% savings banks. It was indeed a strange state of affairs, and a sorry one for many worthy and God-fearing men. For the first time in the history of the Republic, almost any negro north of Georgia could change a $1 bill. But as at that time the cent was rapidly approaching the purchasing power of the Chinese ubu, and was only a thing you got back occasionally after paying for a soft drink, and could use merely in getting your correct weight, this was perhaps not so strange a phenomenon as it at first seems. It was too curious a state of things, however, for Merlin Grainger to take the step that he did take, the hazardous, almost involuntary step of proposing to Miss Masters. Stranger still, that she accepted him. It was at Pulpat's on Saturday night, and over a $1.75 bottle of water diluted with vin ordinaire, that the proposal occurred.
"Mine makes me feel all tingly, doesn't it you?" chattered Miss Masters gaily.
"Yes," answered Merlin absently, and then, after a long and pregnant pause,
"Miss Masters, Olive, I want to say something to you if you'll listen to me."
The tingliness of Miss Masters, who knew what was coming, increased until it seemed that she would shortly be electrocuted by her own nervous reactions. But her "Yes, Merlin" came without a sign or flicker of interior disturbance. Merlin swallowed a stray bit of air that he found in his mouth.
"I have no fortune," he said with the manner of making an announcement. "I have no fortune at all."
Their eyes met, locked, became wistful and dreamy and beautiful.
"Olive," he told her, "I love you."
"I love you too, Merlin," she answered simply. "Shall we have another bottle of wine?"
"Yes," he cried, his heart beating at a great rate. "Do you mean—"
"To drink to our engagement," she interrupted bravely. "May it be a short one."
"No,"
he almost shouted, bringing his fist fiercely down upon the table.
"May it last forever."
"What?"
"I mean, oh, I see what you mean. You're right. May it be a short one."
He laughed and added,
"My error."
After the wine arrived, they discussed the matter thoroughly.
"We'll have to take a small apartment at first," he said. "And I believe, yes, by golly, I know there's a small one in the house where I live, a big room and a sort of dressing room kitchenette and the use of a bath on the same floor." She clapped her hands happily, and he thought how pretty she was really, that is, the upper part of her face. From the bridge of the nose down she was somewhat out of true. She continued enthusiastically, "And as soon as we can afford it, we'll take a real swell apartment with an elevator and a telephone girl." "And after that a place in the country, and a car."
"I can't imagine nothing more fun. Can you?" Merlin fell silent a moment. He was thinking that he would have to give up his room, the 4th floor rear. Yet it mattered very little now. During the past year and a half, in fact, from the very date of Caroline's visit to the Moonlight Quill, he had never seen her. For a week after that visit her lights had failed to go on. Darkness brooded out into the areaway, seemed to grope blindly in at his expectant, uncurtained window. Then the lights had appeared at last, and instead of Caroline and her callers, they showed a stodgy family. A little man with a bristly mustache and a full-bosomed woman who spent her evenings patting her hips and rearranging bric-a-brac. After 2 days of them, Merlin had callously pulled down his shade. No, Merlin could think of nothing more fun than rising in the world with Olive. There would be a cottage in the suburb, a cottage painted blue, just one class below the sort of cottages that are of white stucco with a green roof. In the grass around the cottage would be rusty trowels and a broken green bench and a baby carriage with a wicker body that sagged to the left. And around the grass and the baby carriage and the cottage itself, around his whole world, there would be the arms of Olive, a little stouter, the arms of her neo-Olivian period, when, as she walked, her cheeks would tremble up and down ever so slightly from too much face massaging. He could hear her voice now, 2 spoons' length away.
"I knew you were going to say this tonight, Merlin. I could see."
She could see. Ah, suddenly he wondered how much she could see. Could she see that the girl who had come in with a party of 3 men and sat down at the next table was Caroline? Ah, could she see that? Could she see that the men brought with them liquor far more potent than Pulpat's red ink condensed threefold? Merlin stared breathlessly, half hearing through an auditory ether Olive's low, soft monologue, as like a persistent honey bee she sucked sweetness from her memorable hour. Merlin was listening to the clinking of ice, and the fine laughter of all four at some pleasantry, and that laughter of Caroline's that he knew so well stirred him, lifted him, called his heart imperiously over to her table, whither it obediently went. He could see her quite plainly, and he fancied that in the last year and a half she had changed, if ever so slightly. Was it the light, or were her cheeks a little thinner, and her eyes less fresh, if more liquid, than of old? Yet the shadows were still purple in her russet hair. Her mouth hinted yet of kisses, as did the profile that came sometimes between his eyes and a row of books, when it was twilight in the bookshop where the crimson lamp presided no more. And she had been drinking. The threefold flush on her cheeks was compounded of youth and wine and fine cosmetic. That he could tell. She was making great amusement for the young man on her left, and the portly person on her right, even for the old fellow opposite her, for the latter from time to time uttered the shocked and mildly reproachful cackles of another generation. Merlin caught the words of a song she was intermittently singing. "Just snap your fingers at care, don't cross the bridge till you're there." The portly person filled her glass with chill amber. A waiter, after several trips about the table and many helpless glances at Caroline, who was maintaining a cheerful, futile questionnaire as to the succulence of this dish or that, managed to obtain the semblance of an order and hurried away. Olive was speaking to Merlin. "When then?" she asked, her voice faintly shaded with disappointment. He realized that he had just answered no to some question she had answered him. "Oh, sometime." "Don't you care?" A rather pathetic poignancy in her question brought his eyes back to her. "As soon as possible, dear," he replied with surprising tenderness. "In 2 months, in June." "So soon?" Her delightful excitement quite took her breath away. "Oh yes, I think we'd better say June. No use waiting." Olive began to pretend that 2 months was really too short a time for her to make preparations. Wasn't he a bad boy? Wasn't he impatient, though? Well, she'd show him he mustn't be too quick with her. Indeed, he was so sudden, she didn't exactly know whether she ought to marry him at all. "June," he repeated sternly. Olive sighed and smiled and drank her coffee, her little finger lifted high above the others in true refined fashion. A stray thought came to Merlin that he would like to buy 5 rings and throw at it. "By gosh!" he exclaimed aloud. Soon he would be putting rings on one of her fingers. His eyes swung sharply to the right. The party of 4 had become so riotous that the head waiter had approached and spoken to them. Caroline was arguing with this head waiter in a raised voice, a voice so clear and young that it seemed as though the whole restaurant would listen, the whole restaurant except Olive Masters, self-absorbed in her new secret. "How do you do?" Caroline was saying. "Probably the handsomest head waiter in captivity. Too much noise? Very unfortunate. Something'll have to be done about it. Gerald," she addressed the man on her right, "the head waiter says there's too much noise. Appeals to us to have it stopped. What'll I say?" "Shh!" remonstrated Gerald with laughter. "Shh!" And Merlin heard him add in an undertone, "All the bourgeoisie will be aroused. This is where the floor walkers learn French." Caroline sat up straight in sudden alertness. "Where's a floor walker?" she cried. "Show me a floor walker." This seemed to amuse the party, for they all, including Caroline, burst into renewed laughter. The head waiter, after a last conscientious but despairing admonition, became Gallic with his shoulders and retired into the background. Pulpat's, as everyone knows, has the unvarying respectability of the table d'hôte. It is not a gay place in the conventional sense. One comes, drinks the red wine, talks perhaps a little more and a little louder than usual under the low, smoky ceilings, and then goes home. It closes up at 9:30, tight as a drum. The policeman is paid off and given an extra bottle of wine for the missus. The coat room girl hands her tips to the collector, and then darkness crushes the little round tables out of sight and life. But excitement was prepared for Pulpat's this evening, excitement of no mean variety. A girl with russet, purple shadowed hair mounted to her table top and began to dance thereon.
"Sacre nom de Dieu! Come down off there!" cried the head waiter. "Stop that music!"
But the musicians were already playing so loud that they could pretend not to hear his order. Having once been young, they played louder and gayer than ever, and Caroline danced with grace and vivacity, her pink, filmy dress swirling about her, her agile arms playing in supple, tenuous gestures along the smoky air. A group of Frenchmen at a table near by broke into cries of applause, in which other parties joined. In a moment the room was full of clapping and shouting. Half the diners were on their feet, crowding up, and on the outskirts the hastily summoned proprietor was giving indistinct vocal evidences of his desire to put an end to this thing as quickly as possible.
"Merlin," cried Olive, awake and aroused at last. "She's such a wicked girl. Let's get out now."
The fascinated Merlin protested feebly that the check was not paid.
"It's all right. Lay $5 on the table. I despise that girl. I can't bear to look at her."
She was on her feet now, tugging at Merlin's arm. Helplessly, listlessly, and then with what amounted to downright unwillingness, Merlin rose, followed Olive dumbly as she picked her way through the delirious clamour, now approaching its height and threatening to become a wild and memorable riot. Submissively he took his coat and stumbled up half a dozen steps into the moist April air outside, his ears still ringing with the sound of light feet on the table and of laughter all about and over the little world of the café. In silence they walked along toward Fifth Avenue and a bus. It was not until next day that she told him about the wedding, how she had moved the date forward. It was much better that they should be married on the 1st of May. 3. And married they were, in a somewhat stuffy manner, under the chandelier of the flat where Olive lived with her mother. After marriage came elation, and then, gradually, the growth of weariness. Responsibility descended upon Merlin, the responsibility of making his $30 a week and her 20 suffice to keep them respectably fat, and to hide with decent garments the evidence that they were. It was decided after several weeks of disastrous and well nigh humiliating experiments with restaurants that they would join the great army of the delicatessen fed. So he took up his old way of life again, in that he stopped every evening at Brig Dort's delicatessen and bought potatoes in salad, ham in slices, and sometimes even stuffed tomatoes in bursts of extravagance. Then he would trudge homeward, enter the dark hallway, and climb 3 rickety flights of stairs covered by an ancient carpet of long obliterated design. The hall had an ancient smell, of the vegetables of 1880, of the furniture polish in vogue when Adam and Eve Bryan ran against William McKinley, of portieres an ounce heavier with dust, from worn-out shoes, and lint from dresses turned long since into patchwork quilts. This smell would pursue him up the stairs, revivified and made poignant at each landing by the aura of contemporary cooking, then, as he began the next flight, diminishing into the odour of the dead routine of dead generations. Eventually would occur the door of his room, which slipped open with indecent willingness and closed with almost a sniff upon his "Hello, dear. Got a treat for you tonight." Olive, who always rode home on the bus to get a morsel of air, would be making the bed and hanging up things. At his call she would come up to him and give him a quick kiss with wide open eyes, while he held her upright like a ladder, his hands on her 2 arms, as though she were a thing without equilibrium, and would, once he relinquished hold, fall swiftly backward to the floor. This is the kiss that comes in with the 2nd year of marriage, succeeding the bridegroom kiss, which is rather stagey at best, say those who know about such things, and apt to be copied from passionate movies. Then came supper, and after that they went out for a walk, up 2 blocks and through Central Park, or sometimes to a moving picture, which taught them patiently that they were the sort of people for whom life was ordered, and that something very grand and brave and beautiful would soon happen to them if they were docile and obedient to their rightful superiors and kept away from pleasure. Such was their day for 3 years. Then change came into their lives. Olive had a baby, and as a result Merlin had a new influx of material resources. In the 3rd week of Olive's confinement, after an hour of nervous rehearsing, he went into the office of Mr. Moonlight Quill and demanded an enormous increase in salary. "I've been here 10 years," he said, "since I was 19. I've always tried to do my best in the interests of the business." Mr. Moonlight Quill said that he would think it over. Next morning he announced, to Merlin's great delight, that he was going to put into effect a project long premeditated. He was going to retire from active work in the bookshop, confining himself to periodic visits and leaving Merlin as manager, with a salary of $50 a week and a 1/10 interest in the business. When the old man finished, Merlin's cheeks were glowing and his eyes full of tears. He seized his employer's hand and shook it violently, saying over and over again,
"It's very nice of you, sir. It's very white of you. It's very, very nice of you."
So after 10 years of faithful work in the store he had won out at last. Looking back, he saw his own progress toward this hill of elation no longer as a sometimes sordid and always gray decade of worry and failing enthusiasm and failing dreams, years when the moonlight had grown duller in the areaway and the youth had faded out of Olive's face, but as a glorious and triumphant climb over obstacles which he had determinedly surmounted by unconquerable will power. The optimistic self-delusion that had kept him from misery was seen now in the golden garments of stern resolution. Half a dozen times he had taken steps to leave the moonlight quill and soar upward, but through sheer faint-heartedness he had stayed on. Strangely enough, he now thought that those were times when he had exerted tremendous persistence and had determined to fight it out where he was. At any rate, let us not for the moment begrudge Merlin his new and magnificent view of himself. He had arrived. He left the shop that evening fairly radiant, invested every penny in his pocket in the most tremendous feast that Braegdort's delicatessen offered, and staggered homeward with the great news in 4 gigantic paper bags. The fact that Olive was too sick to eat, that he made himself faintly but unmistakably ill by a struggle with 4 stuffed tomatoes, and that most of the food deteriorated rapidly in an iceless icebox, all next day did not mar the occasion. For the first time since the week of his marriage, Merlin Grainger lived under a sky of unclouded tranquillity. The baby boy was christened Arthur, and life became dignified, significant, and at length centered. Merlin and Olive resigned themselves to a somewhat secondary place in their own cosmos, but what they lost in personality they regained in a sort of primordial pride. The country house did not come, but a month in an Ashbury Park boarding house each summer filled the gap. And during Merlin's 2 weeks' holiday this excursion assumed the air of a really merry jaunt, especially when, with the baby asleep in a wide room opening technically on the sea, Merlin strolled with Olive along the thronged boardwalk, puffing at his cigar and trying to look like 20,000 a year. With some alarm at the slowing up of the days and the accelerating of the years, Merlin became 31, 32, then almost with a rush arrived at that age which, with all its washing and panning, can only muster a bare handful of the precious stuff of youth. He became 35. And one day, on Fifth Avenue, he saw Caroline. It was Sunday, a radiant, flowerful Easter morning, and the avenue was a pageant of lilies and cutaways and happy April colored bonnets. 12 o'clock. The great churches were letting out their people. St. Simon's, St. Hilda's, the Church of the Epistles, opened their doors like wide mouths until the people pouring forth surely resembled happy laughter as they met and strolled and chattered, or else waved white bouquets at the waiting chauffeurs. In front of the Church of the Epistles stood its 12 vestrymen, carrying out the time-honored custom of giving away Easter eggs full of face powder to the church-going debutantes of the year. Around them delightedly danced the 2,000 miraculously groomed children of the very rich, correctly cute and curled, shining like sparkling little jewels upon their mothers' fingers. Speaks the sentimentalist for the children of the poor? Ah, but the children of the rich, laundered, sweet-smelling, complexioned of the country, and, above all, with soft indoor voices. Little Arthur was 5, child of the middle class, undistinguished, unnoticed, with a nose that forever marred what Grecian yearnings his features might have had. He held tightly to his mother's warm, sticky hand, and, with Merlin on his other side, moved upon the home-coming throng. At 53rd Street, where there were 2 churches, the congestion was at its thickest, its richest. Their progress was of necessity retarded to such an extent that even little Arthur had not the slightest difficulty in keeping up. Then it was that Merlin perceived an open landaulet of deepest crimson, with handsome nickel trimmings, glide slowly up to the curb and come to a stop. In it sat Caroline. She was dressed in black, a tight-fitting gown trimmed with lavender, flowered at the waist with a corsage of orchids. Merlin started and then gazed at her fearfully. For the first time in the 8 years since his marriage he was encountering the girl again. But a girl no longer. Her figure was slim as ever, or perhaps not quite, for a certain boyish swagger, a sort of insolent adolescence, had gone the way of the first blooming of her cheeks, but she was beautiful. Dignity was there now, and the charming lines of a fortuitous 29, and she sat in the car with such perfect appropriateness and self-possession that it made him breathless to watch her. Suddenly she smiled, the smile of old, bright as that very Easter and its flowers, mellower than ever, yet somehow with not quite the radiance and infinite promise of that first smile back there in the bookshop 9 years before. It was a steelier smile, disillusioned and sad. But it was soft enough and smile enough to make a pair of young men in cutaway coats hurry over, to pull their high hats off their wetted iridescent hair, to bring them, flustered and bowing, to the edge of her landaulet, where her lavender gloves gently touched their grey ones. And these two were presently joined by another, and then two more, until there was a rapidly swelling crowd around the landaulet. Merlin would hear a young man beside him say to his perhaps well-favoured companion: "If you'll just pardon me a moment, there's some one I have to speak to. Walk right ahead, I'll catch up." Within 3 minutes every inch of the landaulet, front and back and side, was occupied by a man trying to construct a sentence clever enough to find its way to Caroline through the stream of conversation. Luckily for Merlin, a portion of little Arthur's clothing had chosen the opportunity to threaten a collapse, and Olive had hurriedly rushed him over against a building for some extemporaneous repair work, so Merlin was able to watch unhindered the salon in the street. The crowd swelled. A row formed in back of the first, two more behind that. In the midst, an orchid rising from a black bouquet, sat Caroline enthroned in her obliterated car, nodding and crying salutations and smiling with such true happiness that, of a sudden, a new relay of gentlemen had left their wives and consorts and were striding toward her. The crowd, now phalanx deep, began to be augmented by the merely curious. Men of all ages, who could not possibly have known Caroline, jostled over and melted into the circle of ever increasing diameter, until the lady in lavender was the centre of a vast impromptu auditorium. All about her were faces, clean shaven, bewhiskered, old, young, ageless, and now, here and there, a woman. The mass was rapidly spreading to the opposite curb, and, as St. Anthony's around the corner let out its box holders, it overflowed to the sidewalk and crushed up against the iron picket fence of a millionaire across the street. The motors speeding along the avenue were compelled to stop, and in a jiffy were piled 3, 5, and 6 deep at the edge of the crowd. Autobuses, top-heavy turtles of traffic, plunged into the jam, their passengers crowding to the edges of the roofs in wild excitement and peering down into the centre of the mass, which presently could hardly be seen from the mass's edge. The crush had become terrific. No fashionable audience at a Yale-Princeton football game, no damp mob at a World Series could be compared with the panoply that talked, stared, laughed, and honked about the lady in black and lavender. It was stupendous. It was terrible. A quarter mile down the block a half-frantic policeman called his precinct. On the same corner a frightened civilian crashed in the glass of a fire alarm and sent in a wild paean for all the fire engines of the city. Up in an apartment high in one of the tall buildings a hysterical old maid telephoned in turn for the prohibition enforcement agent, the special deputies on Bolshevism, and the maternity ward of Bellevue Hospital. The noise increased. The first fire engine arrived, filling the Sunday air with smoke, clanging and crying a brazen metallic message down the high resounding walls. In the notion that some terrible calamity had overtaken the city, two excited deacons ordered special services immediately and set tolling the great bells of St. Hilda's and St. Anthony's, presently joined by the jealous gongs of St. Simon's and the Church of the Epistles. Even far off in the Hudson and the East River the sounds of the commotion were heard, and the ferry boats and tugs and ocean liners set up sirens and whistles that sailed in melancholy cadence, now varied, now reiterated across the whole diagonal width of the city from Riverside Drive to the grey waterfronts of the Lower East Side. In the centre of her landaulet sat the lady in black and lavender, chatting pleasantly first with one, then another of that fortunate few in cutaways who had found their way to speaking distance in the first rush. After a while she glanced around her and beside her with a look of growing annoyance. She yawned and asked the man nearest her if he couldn't run in somewhere and get her a glass of water. The man apologized in some embarrassment. He could not have moved hand or foot. He could not have scratched his own ear. As the first blast of the river sirens keened along the air, Olive fastened the last safety pin in little Arthur's rompers and looked up. Merlin saw her start, stiffen slowly like hardening stucco, and then give a little gasp of surprise and disapproval. "That woman!" she cried suddenly. "Oh!" She flashed a glance at Merlin that mingled reproach and pain, and without another word gathered up little Arthur with one hand, grasped her husband by the other, and darted amazingly in a winding, bumping canter through the crowd. Somehow people gave way before her. Somehow she managed to retain her grasp on her son and husband. Somehow she managed to emerge 2 blocks up, battered and dishevelled, into an open space, and without slowing up her pace darted down a side street. Then at last, when uproar had died away into a dim and distant clamour, did she come to a walk and set little Arthur upon his feet. "And on Sunday, too! Hasn't she disgraced herself enough?" This was her only comment. She said it to Arthur, as she seemed to address her remarks to Arthur throughout the remainder of the day. For some curious and esoteric reason, she had never once looked at her husband during the entire retreat. 4. The years between 35 and 65 revolve before the passive mind as one unexplained, confusing merry-go-round. True, they are a merry-go-round of ill-gaited and wind-broken horses, painted first in pastel colours, then in dull greys and browns, but perplexing and intolerably dizzy the thing is, as never were the merry-go-rounds of childhood or adolescence, as never surely were the certain coursed, dynamic roller coasters of youth. For most men and women these 30 years are taken up with a gradual withdrawal from life, a retreat first from a front with many shelters, those myriad amusements and curiosities of youth, to a line with less, when we peel down our ambitions to one ambition, our recreations to one recreation, our friends to a few to whom we are anaesthetic, ending up at last in a solitary, desolate strong point that is not strong, where the shells now whistle abominably, now are but half heard, as by turns frightened and tired we sit waiting for death. At 40, then, Merlin was no different from himself at 35. A larger paunch, a grey twinkling near his ears, a more certain lack of vivacity in his walk. His 45 differed from his 40 by a like margin, unless one mention of a slight deafness in his left ear. But at 55 the process had become a chemical change of immense rapidity. Yearly he was more and more an old man to his family, senile almost, so far as his wife was concerned. He was by this time complete owner of the bookshop. The mysterious Mr. Moonlight Quill, dead some 5 years and not survived by his wife, had deeded the whole stock and store to him, and there he still spent his days, conversant now by name with almost all that man has recorded for 3,000 years, a human catalogue, an authority upon tooling and binding, upon folios and first editions, an accurate inventory of 1,000 authors whom he could never have understood and had certainly never read. At 65 he distinctly doddered. He had assumed the melancholy habits of the aged so often portrayed by the second old man in standard Victorian comedies. He consumed vast warehouses of time searching for mislaid spectacles. He nagged his wife and was nagged in turn. He told the same jokes 3 or 4 times a year at the family table, and gave his son weird, impossible directions as to his conduct in life. Mentally and materially he was so entirely different from the Merlin Grainger of 25 that it seemed incongruous that he should bear the same name. He worked still in the bookshop with the assistance of a youth, whom, of course, he considered very idle indeed, and a new young woman, Miss Gaffney. Miss McCracken, ancient and unvenerable as himself, still kept the accounts. Young Arthur was gone into Wall Street to sell bonds, as all the young men seemed to be doing in that day. This, of course, was as it should be. Let old Merlin get what magic he could from his books. The place of young King Arthur was in the counting house. One afternoon at 4, when he had slipped noiselessly up to the front of the store on his soft-soled slippers, led by a newly formed habit of which, to be fair, he was rather ashamed, of spying upon the young man clerk, he looked casually out of the front window, straining his faded eyesight to reach the street. A limousine, large, portentous, impressive, had drawn to the curb, and the chauffeur, after dismounting and holding some sort of conversation with persons in the interior of the car, turned about and advanced in a bewildered fashion toward the entrance of the Moonlight Quill. He opened the door, shuffled in, and, glancing uncertainly at the old man in the skull cap, addressed him in a thick, murky voice, as though his words came through a fog. "Do you sell editions?" Merlin nodded. "The arithmetic books are in the back of the store." The chauffeur took off his cap and scratched a close-cropped, fuzzy head. "Oh, nah, this I want's a deteckative story." He jerked a thumb back toward the limousine. "She seen it in the paper. First edition." Merlin's interest quickened. Here was possibly a big sale. "Oh, editions, yes, we've advertised some firsts, but detective stories? I don't believe. What was the title?" "I forgot. About a crime." I have The Crimes of the Borgias, full Morocco, London, 1769, beautifully." "Nah," interrupted the chauffeur. "This was one fella did this crime. She seen you had it for sale in the paper." He rejected several possible titles with the air of connoisseur. "Silver Bones," he announced suddenly, out of a slight pause. "What?" demanded Merlin, suspecting that the stiffness of his sinews were being commented upon. "Silver Bones. That was the guy that done the crime." "Silver Bones?" "Silver Bones. Indian, maybe." Merlin stroked his grizzly cheeks. "Geez, mister," went on the prospective purchaser, "if you want to save me an awful bawling out, just try and think. The old lady goes wild if everything don't run smooth." But Merlin's musings on the subject of Silver Bones were as futile as his obliging search through the shelves, and 5 minutes later a very dejected charioteer wound his way back to his mistress. Through the glass Merlin could see the visible symbols of a tremendous uproar going on in the interior of the limousine. The chauffeur made wild, appealing gestures of his innocence, evidently to no avail, for when he turned around and climbed back into the driver's seat his expression was not a little dejected. Then the door of the limousine opened and gave forth a pale and slender young man of about 20, dressed in the attenuation of fashion and carrying a wisp of a cane. He entered the shop, walked past Merlin, and proceeded to take out a cigarette and light it. Merlin approached him. "Anything I can do for you, sir?" "Old boy," said the youth coolly, "there are several things. You can first let me smoke my ciggy here out of sight of that old lady in the limousine, who happens to be my grandmother. Her knowledge as to whether I smoke it or not before my majority happens to be a matter of $5,000 to me. The second thing is that you should look up your first edition of The Crime of Sylvester Bonnard that you advertised in last Sunday's Times. My grandmother there happens to want to take it off your hands." Deteckative story. Crime of somebody. Silver Bones. All was explained. With a faint deprecatory chuckle, as if to say that he would have enjoyed this had life put him in the habit of enjoying anything, Merlin doddered away to the back of his shop, where his treasures were kept, to get his latest investment, which he had picked up rather cheaply at the sale of a big collection. When he returned with it, the young man was drawing on his cigarette and blowing out quantities of smoke with immense satisfaction. "My God," he said, "she keeps me so close to her the entire day, running idiotic errands, that this happens to be my first puff in 6 hours. What's the world coming to, I ask you, when a feeble old lady in the milk toast era can dictate to a man as to his personal vices? I happen to be unwilling to be so dictated to. Let's see the book." Merlin passed it to him tenderly, and the young man, after opening it with a carelessness that gave a momentary jump to the book dealer's heart, ran through the pages with his thumb. "No illustrations, eh?" he commented. "Well, old boy, what's it worth? Speak up. We're willing to give you a fair price, though why, I don't know." "$100," said Merlin with a frown. The young man gave a startled whistle. "Come on, you're not dealing with somebody from the corn belt. I happen to be a city bred man, and my grandmother happens to be a city bred woman, though I'll admit it'd take a special tax appropriation to keep her in repair. We'll give you $25, and let me tell you that's liberal. We've got books in our attic, up in our attic with my old playthings, that were written before the old boy that wrote this was born." Merlin stiffened, expressing a rigid and meticulous horror.
"Did your grandmother give you $25 to buy this with?"
"She did not. She gave me 50, but she expects change. I know that old lady."
"You tell her," said Merlin with dignity, "that she has missed a very great bargain."
"Give you 40," urged the young man. "Come on now, be reasonable and don't try to hold us up." Merlin had wheeled around with the precious volume under his arm and was about to return it to its special drawer in his office when there was a sudden interruption. With unheard of magnificence the front door burst rather than swung open, and admitted in the dark interior a regal apparition in black silk and fur which bore rapidly down upon him. The cigarette leaped from the fingers of the urban young man, and he gave breath to an inadvertent "Damn!" But it was upon Merlin that the entrance seemed to have the most remarkable and incongruous effect, so strong an effect that the greatest treasure of his shop slipped from his hand and joined the cigarette on the floor. Before him stood Caroline. She was an old woman remarkably preserved, unusually handsome, unusually erect, but still an old woman. Her hair was a soft, beautiful white, elaborately dressed and jewelled. Her face, faintly rouged à la grande dame, showed webs of wrinkles at the edges of her eyes, and two deeper lines in the form of stanchions connected her nose and the corners of her mouth. Her eyes were dim, ill-natured, and querulous. But it was Caroline without a doubt. Caroline's features, though in decay. Caroline's figure, if brittle and stiff in movement. Caroline's manner, unmistakably compounded of a delightful insolence and an enviable self-assurance. And, most of all, Caroline's voice, broken and shaky, yet with a ring in it that still could and did make chauffeurs want to drive laundry wagons and cause cigarettes to fall from the fingers of urban grandsons. She stood and sniffed. Her eyes found the cigarette upon the floor. "What's that?" she cried. The words were not a question. They were an entire litany of suspicion, accusation, confirmation, and decision. She tarried over them scarcely an instant. "Stand up," she said to her grandson. "Stand up and blow that nicotine out of your lungs." The young man looked at her in trepidation. "Blow!" she commanded. He pursed his lips feebly and blew into the air. "Blow!" she repeated, more peremptorily than before. He blew again, helplessly, ridiculously. "Do you realize," she went on, "that you've forfeited $5,000 in 5 minutes?" Merlin momentarily expected the young man to fall pleading upon his knees, but such is the nobility of human nature that he remained standing, even blew again into the air, partly from nervousness, partly no doubt with some vague hope of re-ingratiating himself. "Young ass!" cried Caroline. "Once more, just once more, and you leave college and go to work." This threat had such an overwhelming effect upon the young man that he took an even paler pallor than was natural to him. But Caroline was not through. "Do you think I don't know what you and your brothers, yes, and your asinine father too, think of me? Well, I do. You think I'm senile. You think I'm soft. I'm not." She struck herself with her fist as though to prove that she was a mass of muscle and sinew. "And I'll have more brains left when you've got me laid out in the drawing room some sunny day than you and the rest of them were born with." "But grandmother!"
"Be quiet! You, a thin little stick of a boy, who if it weren't for my money might have risen to be a journeyman barber in the Bronx. Let me see your hands. Ugh! The hands of a barber. You presume to be smart with me, who once had 3 counts and a bona fide duke, not to mention half a dozen papal titles, pursue me from the city of Rome to the city of New York." She paused, took breath. "Stand up! Blow!" The young man obediently blew. Simultaneously the door opened and an excited gentleman of middle age, who wore a coat and hat trimmed with fur, and seemed moreover to be trimmed with the same sort of fur himself on upper lip and chin, rushed into the store and up to Caroline. "Found you at last!" he cried. "Been looking for you all over town. Tried your house on the phone and your secretary told me he thought you'd gone to a bookshop called the Moonlight." Caroline turned to him irritably. "Do I employ you for your reminiscences?" she snapped. Are you my tutor or my broker?" "Your broker," confessed the fur-trimmed man, taken somewhat aback. "I beg your pardon. I came about that phonograph stock. I can sell for 105." "Then do it." "Very well. I thought I'd better—" "Go sell it. I'm talking to my grandson." "Very well. Good bye." "Good bye, madam." The fur-trimmed man made a slight bow and turned in some confusion from the shop. "As for you," said Caroline, turning to her grandson, "you stay just where you are and be quiet." She turned to Merlin and included his entire length in a not unfriendly survey. Then she smiled and he found himself smiling too. In an instant they both had broken into a cracked but none the less spontaneous chuckle. She seized his arm and hurried him to the other side of the store. There they stopped, faced each other, and gave vent to another long fit of senile glee. "It's the only way," she gasped in a sort of triumphant malignity. "The only thing that keeps old folks like me happy is the sense that they can make other people step around. To be old and rich and have poor descendants is almost as much fun as to be young and beautiful and have ugly sisters." "Oh yes," chuckled Merlin. "I know. I envy you." She nodded, blinking. "The last time I was in here 40 years ago," she said, "you were a young man very anxious to kick up your heels." "I was," he confessed. "My visit must have meant a good deal to you." "You have all along," he exclaimed. I used to think at first that you were a real person, human, I mean." She laughed. "Many men have thought me inhuman." "But now," continued Merlin excitedly, "I understand. Understanding is allowed to us old people, after nothing much matters. I see now that on a certain night, when you danced upon a table top, you were nothing but my romantic yearning for a beautiful and perverse woman." Her old eyes were far away, her voice no more than an echo of a forgotten dream. "How I danced that night! I remember." "You were making an attempt at me. Olive's arms were closing about me and you warned me to be free and keep my measure of youth and irresponsibility. But it seemed like an effect gotten up at the last moment. It came too late." "You are very old," she said inscrutably. "I did not realize." "Also, I have not forgotten what you did to me when I was 35. You shook me with that traffic tie-up. It was a magnificent effort. The beauty and power you radiated. You became personified even to my wife, and she feared you. For weeks I wanted to slip out of the house at dark and forget the stuffiness of life with music and cocktails and a girl to make me young, but then I no longer knew how. And now you are so very old." With a sort of awe she moved back and away from him. "Yes, leave me," he cried. "You are old also. The spirit withers with the skin. Have you come here only to tell me something I had best forget? That to be old and poor is sometimes more wretched than to be old and rich? To remind me that my son hurls my gray failure in my face?" "Give me my book," she commanded harshly. "Be quick, old man." Merlin looked at her once more and then patiently obeyed. He picked up the book and handed it to her, shaking his head when she offered him a bill. "Why go through the farce of paying me? Once you made me wreck these very premises." "I did," she said in anger, "and I'm glad. Perhaps there had been enough done to ruin me." She gave him a glance, half disdain, half ill-concealed uneasiness, and with a brisk word to her urban grandson moved toward the door. Then she was gone, out of his shop, out of his life. The door clicked. With a sigh he turned and walked brokenly back toward the glass partition that enclosed the yellow accounts of many years as well as the mellowed, wrinkled Miss McCracken. Merlin regarded her parched, cobwebbed face with an odd sort of pity. She, at any rate, had had less from life than he. No rebellious romantic spirit popping out unbidden had, in its memorable moments, given her life a zest and a glory. Then Miss McCracken looked up and spoke to him. "Still a spunky old piece, isn't she?" Merlin started. "Who?" "Old Alicia Dare. Mrs. Thomas Allerdyce she is now, of course. Has been these 30 years." "What? I don't understand you." Merlin sat down suddenly in his swivel chair. His eyes were wide. "Why, surely, Mr. Granger, you can't tell me that you've forgotten her, when for 10 years she was the most notorious character in New York. Why, one time when she was the correspondent in the Throckmorton divorce case, she attracted so much attention on Fifth Avenue that there was a traffic tie-up. Didn't you read about it in the papers?" "I never used to read the papers." His ancient brain was whirring. Well, you can't have forgotten the time she came in here and ruined the business. Let me tell you, I came near asking Mr. Moonlight Quill for my salary and clearing out." "Do you mean that you saw her?" "Saw her? How could I help it with the racket that went on? Heaven knows Mr. Moonlight Quill didn't like it either, but of course he didn't say anything. He was daffy about her, and she could twist him around her little finger. The second he opposed one of her whims, she'd threaten to tell his wife on him. Served him right. The idea of that man falling for a pretty adventuress. Of course, he was never rich enough for her, even though the shop paid well in those days." "But when I saw her," stammered Merlin, "that is, when I saw her, she lived with her mother." "Mother trash!" said Miss McCracken indignantly. "She had a woman there she called auntie, who was no more related to her than I am. Oh, she was a bad one, but clever. Right after the Throckmorton divorce case, she married Thomas Allardyce, and made herself secure for life." "Who was she?" cried Merlin. "For God's sake, what was she? A witch?" "Why, she was Alicia Dare, the dancer, of course. In those days you couldn't pick up a paper without finding her picture."
Merlin sat very quiet, his brain suddenly fatigued and stilled. He was an old man now indeed, so old that it was impossible for him to dream of ever having been young, so old that the glamour was gone out of the world, passing not into the faces of children and into the persistent comforts of warmth and life, but passing out of the range of sight and feeling. He was never to smile again, or to sit a long reverie when spring evenings wafted the cries of children in at his window, until gradually they became the friends of his boyhood out there, urging him to come and play before the last dark came down. He was too old now even for memories. That night he sat at supper with his wife and son, who had used him for their blind purposes. Olive said, "Don't sit there like a death's head. Say something." "Let him sit quiet," growled Arthur. "If you encourage him, he'll tell us a story we've heard 100 times before." Merlin went upstairs very quietly at 9 o'clock. When he was in his room and had closed the door tight, he stood by it for a moment, his thin limbs trembling. He knew now that he had always been a fool. "Oh, russet witch!" But it was too late. He had angered Providence by resisting too many temptations. There was nothing left but heaven, where he would meet only those who, like him, had wasted earth. End of Section 10. Read by Don W. Jenkins. Rancho San Diego, California. shaggybark.blogspot.com. Tales of the Jazz Age by F. Scott Fitzgerald. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. The Lees of Happiness. If you should look through the files of old magazines for the first years of the present century, you would find, sandwiched in between the stories of Richard Harding Davis and Frank Norris, and others long since dead, the work of one Geoffrey Curtin, a novel or two, and perhaps 3 or 4 dozen short stories. You could, if you were interested, follow them along until, say, 1908, when they suddenly disappeared. When you had read them all, you would have been quite sure that there were no masterpieces. Here were passably amusing stories, a bit out of date now, but doubtless the sort that would then have whiled away a dreary hour in a dental office. The man who did them was of good intelligence, talented, glib, probably young. In the samples of his work you found, there would have been nothing to stir you to more than a faint interest in the whims of life, no deep interior laughs, no sense of futility or hint of tragedy. After reading them you would yawn and put the number back in the files, and perhaps, if you were in some library reading room, you would decide that by way of variety you would look at a newspaper of the period and see whether the Japs had taken Port Arthur. But if by any chance the newspaper you had chosen was the right one, and had crackled open at the theatrical page, your eyes would have been arrested and held, and for at least a minute you would have forgotten Port Arthur as quickly as you forgot Chateau Thierry, for you would by this fortunate chance be looking at the portrait of an exquisite woman. Those were the days of Florodora and of sextettes, of pinched-in waists and blown-out sleeves, of almost bustles and absolute ballet skirts, but here, without doubt, disguised as she might be by the unaccustomed stiffness and old fashion of her costume, was a butterfly of butterflies. Here was the gaiety of the period, the soft wine of eyes, the songs that flurried hearts, the toasts and the bouquets, the dances and the dinners. Here was a Venus of the hansom cab, the Gibson girl in her glorious prime. Here was you, find by looking at the name beneath, one Roxanne Milbank, who had been chorus girl and understudy in the Daisy Chain, but who, by reason of an excellent performance when the star was indisposed, had gained a leading part. You would look again and wonder why you had never heard of her. Why did her name not linger in popular songs and vaudeville jokes and cigar bands, and in the memory of that gay old uncle of yours, along with Lillian Russell and Stella Mayhew and Anna Held? Roxanne Milbank, whither had she gone? What dark trap door had opened suddenly and swallowed her up? Her name was certainly not in last Sunday's supplement on the list of actresses married to English noblemen. No doubt she was dead, poor beautiful young lady, and quite forgotten. I am hoping too much. I am having you stumble on Geoffrey Curtins's stories and Roxanne Milbank's picture. It would be incredible that you should find a newspaper item 6 months later, a single item 2 inches by 4, which informed the public of the marriage, very quietly, of Miss Roxanne Milbank, who had been on tour with the Daisy Chain, to Mr. Geoffrey Curtin, the popular author. Mrs. Curtin, it added dispassionately, will retire from the stage. It was a marriage of love. He was sufficiently spoiled to be charming. She was ingenuous enough to be irresistible. Like two floating logs they met in a head-on rush, caught and sped along together. Yet had Geoffrey Curtin kept at scrivening for 20 years he could not have put a quirk into one of his stories weirder than the quirk that came into his own life. Had Roxanne Milbank played 36 parts and filled 5,000 houses, she could never have had a role with more happiness and more despair than were in the fate prepared for Roxanne Curtin. For a year they lived in hotels, traveled to California, to Alaska, to Florida, to Mexico, loved and quarreled gently, and gloried in the golden triflings of his wit with her beauty. They were young and gravely dispassionate. They demanded everything and then yielded everything again in ecstasies of unselfishness and pride. She loved the swift tones of his voice and his frantic, if unfounded, jealousy. He loved her dark radiance, the white irises of her eyes, the warm, lustrous enthusiasm of her smile. "Don't you like her?" he would demand rather excitedly and shyly. "Isn't she wonderful? Did you ever see?" "Yes," they would answer, grinning. "She's a wonder. You're lucky." The year passed. They tired of hotels. They bought an old house and 20 acres near the town of Marlow, half an hour from Chicago. Bought a little car and moved out riotously with a pioneering hallucination that would have confounded Balboa. "Your room will be here," they cried in turn. And then, "And my room here." "And the nursery here when we have children." "And we'll build a sleeping porch, next year." They moved out in April. In July, Geoffrey's closest friend, Harry Cromwell, came to spend a week. They met him at the end of the long lawn and hurried him proudly to the house. Harry was married also. His wife had had a baby some 6 months before and was still recuperating at her mother's in New York. Roxanne had gathered from Geoffrey that Harry's wife was not as attractive as Harry. Geoffrey had met her once and considered her shallow. But Harry had been married nearly 2 years and was apparently happy, so Geoffrey guessed that she was probably all right. "I'm making biscuits," chattered Roxanne gravely. "Can your wife make biscuits? The cook is showing me how. I think every woman should know how to make biscuits. It sounds so utterly disarming. A woman who can make biscuits can surely do no—" "You'll have to come out here and live," said Geoffrey. "Get a place out in the country like us, for you and Kitty." "You don't know Kitty. She hates the country. She's got to have her theatres and vaudevilles." "Bring her out," repeated Geoffrey. "We'll have a colony. There's an awfully nice crowd here already. Bring her out." They were at the porch steps now, and Roxanne made a brisk gesture toward a dilapidated structure on the right. "The garage," she announced. "It will also be Jeffrey's writing room within the month. Meanwhile, dinner is at 7. Meanwhile to that, I will mix a cocktail." The two men ascended to the second floor. That is, they ascended halfway, for at the first landing Jeffrey dropped his guest's suitcase and in a cross between a query and cry exclaimed: "For God's sake, Harry, how do you like her?" "We will go upstairs," answered the guest, "and we will shut the door." Half an hour later, as they were sitting together in the library, Roxanne reissued from the kitchen, bearing before her a pan of biscuits. Jeffrey and Harry arose. "They're beautiful, dear," said the husband intensely. "Exquisite," murmured Harry. Roxanne beamed. "Taste one. I couldn't bear to touch them before you'd seen them all, and I can't bear to take them back until I find out what they taste like." "Like manna, darling." Simultaneously the two men raised the biscuits to their lips, nibbled tentatively. Simultaneously they tried to change the subject. But Roxanne, undeceived, set down the pan and seized a biscuit. After a second her comment rang out with lugubrious finality. "Absolutely bum." "Really? Why, I didn't notice." Roxanne roared. "Oh, I'm useless," she cried, laughing. "Turn me out, Jeffrey. I'm a parasite. I'm no goal." Jeffrey put his arm around her. "Darling, I'll eat your biscuits." "They're beautiful anyway," insisted Roxanne. They're decorative," suggested Harry. Jeffrey took him up wildly. "That's the word. They're decorative. They're masterpieces. We'll use them." He rushed to the kitchen and returned with a hammer and a handful of nails. "We'll use them, by golly, Roxanne. We'll make a frieze out of them." "Don't!" wailed Roxanne. "Our beautiful house." "Never mind. We're going to have the library repapered in October. Don't you remember?" "Well?" Bang! The first biscuit was impaled to the wall, where it quivered for a moment like a live thing. Bang! When Roxanne returned with a second round of cocktails, the biscuits were in a perpendicular row, 12 of them, like a collection of primitive spearheads. "Roxanne!" exclaimed Jeffrey, "you're an artist. Cook? Nonsense. You shall illustrate my books." During the dinner the twilight faltered into dusk, and later it was a starry dark outside, filled and permeated with the frail gorgeousness of Roxanne's white dress and her tremulous low laugh. "Such a little girl she is," thought Harry. "Not as old as Kitty." He compared the two. Kitty, nervous without being sensitive, temperamental without temperament, a woman who seemed to flit and never light, and Roxanne, who was as young as spring night and summed up in her own adolescent laughter. "A good match for Jeffrey," he thought again. "Two very young people, the sort who'll stay very young until they suddenly find themselves old." Harry thought these things between his constant thoughts about Kitty. He was depressed about Kitty. It seemed to him that she was well enough to come back to Chicago and bring his little son. He was thinking vaguely of Kitty when he said good night to his friend's wife and his friend at the foot of the stairs. "You're our first real house guest," called Roxanne after him. "Aren't you thrilled and proud?" When he was out of sight around the stair corner, she turned to Jeffrey, who was standing beside her, resting his hand on the end of the banister. "Are you tired, my dearest?" Jeffrey rubbed the center of his forehead with his fingers. "A little. How did you know?" "Oh, how could I help knowing about you?" "It's a headache," he said moodily. "Splitting. I'll take some aspirin." She reached over and snapped out the light, and with his arm tight about her waist they walked up the stairs together. II Harry's week passed. They drove about the dreaming lanes or idled in cheerful inanity upon lake or lawn. In the evening Roxanne, sitting inside, played to them while the ashes whitened on the glowing ends of their cigars. Then came a telegram from Kitty saying that she wanted Harry to come East and get her, so Roxanne and Jeffrey were left alone in that privacy of which they never seemed to tire. Alone thrilled them again. They wandered about the house, each feeling intimately the presence of the other. They sat on the same side of the table like honeymooners. They were intensely absorbed, intensely happy. The town of Marlowe, though a comparatively old settlement, had only recently acquired a "society." 5 or 6 years before, alarmed at the smoky swelling of Chicago, 2 or 3 young married couples, bungalow people, had moved out. Their friends had followed. The Jeffrey Curtains found an already formed "set" prepared to welcome them. A country club, ballroom, and golf links yawned for them, and there were bridge parties and poker parties, and parties where they drank beer, and parties where they drank nothing at all. It was at a poker party that they found themselves, a week after Harry's departure. There were 2 tables, and a good proportion of the young wives were smoking and shouting their bets, and being very daringly mannish for those days. Roxanne had left the game early and taken to perambulation. She wandered into the pantry and found herself some grape juice. Beer gave her a headache. And then passed from table to table, looking over shoulders at the hands, keeping an eye on Jeffrey and being pleasantly unexcited and content. Jeffrey, with intense concentration, was raising a pile of chips of all colors, and Roxanne knew by the deepened wrinkle between his eyes that he was interested. She liked to see him interested in small things. She crossed over quietly and sat down on the arm of his chair. She sat there 5 minutes, listening to the sharp, intermittent comments of the men and the chatter of the women, which rose from the table like soft smoke, and yet scarcely hearing either. Then quite innocently she reached out her hand, intending to place it on Jeffrey's shoulder. As it touched him he started of a sudden, gave a short grunt, and, sweeping back his arm furiously, caught her a glancing blow on her elbow. There was a general gasp. Roxanne regained her balance, gave a little cry, and rose quickly to her feet. It had been the greatest shock of her life. This from Jeffrey, the heart of kindness, of consideration, this instinctively brutal gesture. The gasp became a silence. A dozen eyes were turned on Jeffrey, who looked up as though seeing Roxanne for the first time. An expression of bewilderment settled on his face. "Why, Roxanne," he said haltingly. In a dozen minds entered a quick suspicion, a rumor of scandal. Could it be that behind the scenes with this couple, apparently so in love, lurked some curious antipathy? Why else this streak of fire across such a cloudless heaven? "Jeffrey!" Roxanne's voice was pleading, startled and horrified. She yet knew that it was a mistake. Not once did it occur to her to blame him or to resent it. Her word was a trembling supplication. "Tell me, Jeffrey," it said. "Tell Roxanne, your own Roxanne." "Why, Roxanne," began Jeffrey again. The bewildered look changed to pain. He was clearly as startled as she. "I didn't intend that," he went on. "You startled me. I felt as if someone were attacking me. Why, how idiotic." "Jeffrey!" Again the word was a prayer, incense offered up to a high God through this new and unfathomable darkness. They were both on their feet. They were saying good bye, faltering, apologizing, explaining. There was no attempt to pass it off easily. That way lay sacrilege. Jeffrey had not been feeling well, they said. He had become nervous. Back of both their minds was the unexplained horror of that blow, the marvel that there had been for an instant something between them, his anger and her fear, and now to both a sorrow, momentary, no doubt, but to be bridged at once, while there was yet time. Was that swift water lashing under their feet, the fierce glint of some uncharted chasm? Out in their car under the harvest moon he talked brokenly. It was just incomprehensible to him, he said. He had been thinking of the poker game, absorbed, and the touch on his shoulder had seemed like an attack. An attack! He clung to that word, flung it up as a shield. He had hated what touched him. With the impact of his hand it had gone, that nervousness. That was all he knew. Both their eyes filled with tears, and they whispered love there under the broad night as the serene streets of Marlowe sped by. Later, when they went to bed, they were quite calm. Jeffrey was to take a week off all work, was simply to loll and sleep and go on long walks until this nervousness left him. When they had decided this, safety settled down upon Roxanne. The pillows underhead became soft and friendly. The bed on which they lay seemed wide and white, and sturdy beneath the radiance that streamed in at the window. 5 days later, in the first cool of late afternoon, Jeffrey picked up an oak chair and sent it crashing through his own front window. Then he lay down on the couch like a child, weeping piteously and begging to die. A blood clot the size of a marble had broken his brain. 3. There is a sort of waking nightmare that sets in sometimes when one has missed a sleep or two, a feeling that comes with extreme fatigue and a new sun, that the quality of life around has changed. It is a fully articulate conviction that somehow the existence one is then leading is a branch shoot of life and is related to life only as a moving picture or a mirror, that the people and streets and houses are only projections from a very dim and chaotic past. It was in such a state that Roxanne found herself during the first months of Jeffrey's illness. She slept only when she was utterly exhausted. She awoke under a cloud. The long, sober-voiced consultations, the faint aura of medicine in the halls, the sudden tiptoeing in a house that had echoed to many cheerful footsteps, and, most of all, Jeffrey's white face amid the pillows of the bed they had shared. These things subdued her and made her indelibly older. The doctors held out hope, but that was all. A long rest, they said, and quiet. So responsibility came to Roxanne. It was she who paid the bills, pored over his bank book, corresponded with his publishers. She was in the kitchen constantly. She learned from the nurse how to prepare his meals, and after the first month took complete charge of the sick room. She had to let the nurse go for reasons of economy. One of the two colored girls left at the same time. Roxanne was realizing that they had been living from short story to short story. The most frequent visitor was Harry Cromwell. He had been shocked and depressed by the news, and though his wife was now living with him in Chicago, he found time to come out several times a month. Roxanne found his sympathy welcome. There was some quality of suffering in the man, some inherent pitifulness that made her comfortable when he was near. Roxanne's nature had suddenly deepened. She felt sometimes that with Jeffrey she was losing her children also, those children that now most of all she needed and should have had. It was 6 months after Jeffrey's collapse, and when the nightmare had faded, leaving not the old world but a new one, grayer and colder, that she went to see Harry's wife. Finding herself in Chicago with an extra hour before train time, she decided out of courtesy to call. As she stepped inside the door, she had an immediate impression that the apartment was very like some place she had been before, and almost instantly she remembered the round-the-corner bakery of her childhood, a bakery full of rows and rows of pink frosted cakes, a stuffy pink as a food, pink, triumphant, vulgar, and odious. And this apartment was like that. It was pink. It smelled pink. Mrs. Cromwell, attired in a wrapper of pink and black, opened the door. Her hair was yellow, heightened, Roxanne imagined, by a dash of peroxide in the rinsing water every week. Her eyes were a thin waxen blue. She was pretty and too consciously graceful. Her cordiality was strident and intimate. Hostility melted so quickly to hospitality that it seemed they were both merely in the face and voice, never touching nor touched by the deep core of egotism beneath. But to Roxanne these things were secondary. Her eyes were caught and held in uncanny fascination by the wrapper. It was vilely unclean. From its lowest hem up 4 inches it was sheerly dirty with the blue dust of the floor. For the next 3 inches it was gray. Then it shaded off into its natural color, which was pink. It was dirty at the sleeves too, and at the collar, and when the woman turned to lead the way into the parlor, Roxanne was sure that her neck was dirty. A one-sided rattle of conversation began. Mrs. Cromwell became explicit about her likes and dislikes, her head, her stomach, her teeth, her apartment, avoiding with a sort of insolent meticulousness any inclusion of Roxanne with life, as if presuming that Roxanne, having been dealt a blow, wished life to be carefully skirted. Roxanne smiled. That kimono, that neck. After 5 minutes a little boy toddled into the parlor, a dirty little boy clad in dirty pink rompers. His face was smudgy. Roxanne wanted to take him into her lap and wipe his nose. Other parts of his head needed attention. His tiny shoes were kicked out at the toes, unspeakable. "What a darling little boy!" exclaimed Roxanne, smiling radiantly. "Come here to me." Mrs. Cromwell looked coldly at her son. "He will get dirty. Look at that face." She held her head on one side and regarded it critically.
"Isn't he a darling?" repeated Roxanne. "Look at his rompers," frowned Mrs. Cromwell. "He needs a change, don't you, George?"
George stared at her curiously. To his mind the word rompers connotated a garment extraneously smeared, as this one.
"I tried to make him look respectable this morning," complained Mrs. Cromwell, as one whose patience had been sorely tried, "and I found he didn't have any more rompers, so rather than have him go around without any, I put him back in those. And his face, how many pairs has he?" Roxanne's voice was pleasantly curious. "How many feather fans have you?" she might have asked. "Oh,"
Mrs. Cromwell considered, wrinkling her pretty brow.
"5, I think. Plenty, I know." "You can get them for 50 cents a pair."
Mrs. Cromwell's eyes showed surprise and the faintest superiority. The price of rompers!
"Can you really? I had no idea. He ought to have plenty, but I haven't had a minute all week to send the laundry out."
Then, dismissing the subject as irrelevant,
"I must show you some things."
they rose, and Roxanne followed her past an open bathroom door whose garment-littered floor showed indeed that the laundry hadn't been sent out for some time, into another room that was, so to speak, the quintessence of pinkness. It was Mrs. Cromwell's room. Here the hostess opened a closet door and displayed before Roxanne's eyes an amazing collection of lingerie. There were dozens of filmy marvels of lace and silk, all clean, unruffled, seemingly not yet touched. On hangers beside them were 3 new evening dresses.
"I have some beautiful things," said Mrs. Cromwell, "but not much of a chance to wear them. Harry doesn't care about going out."
Spite crept into her voice.
"He's perfectly content to let me play nursemaid and housekeeper all day, and loving wife in the evening."
Roxanne smiled again.
"You've got some beautiful clothes here." "Yes, I have. Let me show you." "Beautiful," repeated Roxanne, interrupting. "But I'll have to run if I'm going to catch my train."
She felt that her hands were trembling. She wanted to put them on this woman and shake her, shake her. She wanted her locked up somewhere and set to scrubbing floors.
"Beautiful," she repeated, "and I just came in for a moment." "Well, I'm sorry Harry isn't here."
They moved toward the door.
"And oh,"
said Roxanne with an effort, yet her voice was still gentle and her lips were smiling,
"I think it's Argyle's where you can get those rompers. Good bye."
It was not until she had reached the station and bought her ticket to Marlowe that Roxanne realized it was the first 5 minutes in 6 months that her mind had been off Jeffrey. 4. A week later Harry appeared at Marlowe, arrived unexpectedly at 5 o'clock, and coming up the walk sank into a porch chair in a state of exhaustion. Roxanne herself had had a busy day and was worn out. The doctors were coming at 5:30, bringing a celebrated nerve specialist from New York. She was excited and thoroughly depressed, but Harry's eyes made her sit down beside him.
"What's the matter?"
"Nothing, Roxanne," he denied. "I came to see how Jeff was doing. Don't you bother about me."
"Harry," insisted Roxanne, "there's something the matter."
"Nothing," he repeated. "How's Jeff?" Anxiety darkened her face.
"He's a little worse, Harry. Dr. Jewett has come on from New York. They thought he could tell me something definite. He's going to try and find whether this paralysis has anything to do with the original blood clot."
Harry rose.
"Oh, I'm sorry," he said jerkily. "I didn't know you expected a consultation. I wouldn't have come. I thought I'd just rock on your porch for an hour."
"Sit down," she commanded.
Harry hesitated.
"Sit down, Harry, dear boy."
Her kindness flooded out now, enveloped him.
"I know there's something the matter. You're white as a sheet. I'm going to get you a cool bottle of beer."
All at once he collapsed into his chair and covered his face with his hands.
"I can't make her happy," he said slowly. "I've tried and I've tried. This morning we had some words about breakfast. I'd been getting my breakfast downtown and, well, just after I went to the office she left the house, went east to her mother's with George in a suitcase full of lace underwear."
"Harry!"
"And I don't know."
There was a crunch on the gravel, a car turning into the drive. Roxanne uttered a little cry.
"It's Dr. Jewett."
"Oh, I'll "
"You'll wait, won't you?" she interrupted abstractedly.
He saw that his problem had already died on the troubled surface of her mind. There was an embarrassing minute of vague, elided instructions, and then Harry followed the party inside and watched them disappear up the stairs. He went into the library and sat down on the big sofa. For an hour he watched the sun creep up the patterned folds of the chintz curtains. In the deep quiet a trapped wasp buzzing on the inside of the window pane assumed the proportions of a clamour. From time to time another buzzing drifted down from upstairs, resembling several more larger wasps caught on larger window panes. He heard low footfalls, the clink of bottles, the clamour of pouring water. What had he and Roxanne done that life should deal these crashing blows to them? Upstairs there was taking place a living inquest on the soul of his friend. He was sitting here in a quiet room listening to the plaint of a wasp, just as when he was a boy he had been compelled by a strict aunt to sit hour-long on a chair and atone for some misbehaviour. But who had put him here? What ferocious aunt had leaned out of the sky to make him atone for what? About Kitty he felt a great hopelessness. She was too expensive, that was the irremediable difficulty. Suddenly he hated her. He wanted to throw her down and kick at her, to tell her she was a cheat and a leech, that she was dirty. Moreover, she must give him his boy. He rose and began pacing up and down the room. Simultaneously he heard someone begin walking along the hallway upstairs in exact time with him. He found himself wondering if they would walk in time until the person reached the end of the hall. Kitty had gone to her mother. God help her, what a mother to go to! He tried to imagine the meeting, the abused wife collapsing upon the mother's breast. He could not. That Kitty was capable of any deep grief was unbelievable. He had gradually grown to think of her as something unapproachable and callous. She would get a divorce, of course, and eventually she would marry again. He began to consider this. Whom would she marry? He laughed bitterly, stopped. A picture flashed before him, of Kitty's arms around some man whose face he could not see, of Kitty's lips pressed close to other lips in what was surely passion. "God!" he cried aloud. "God! God! God!" Then the pictures came thick and fast. The Kitty of this morning faded, the soiled kimono rolled up and disappeared. The pouts and rages and tears were all washed away. Again she was Kitty Carr with yellow hair and great baby eyes. Ah, she had loved him. She had loved him. After a time he perceived that something was amiss with him, something that had nothing to do with Kitty or Jeff, something of a different genre. Amazingly it burst on him at last. He was hungry. Simple enough. He would go into the kitchen in a moment and ask the colored cook for a sandwich. After that he must go back to the city. He paused at the wall, jerked at something round and, fingering it absently, put it to his mouth and tasted it as a baby tastes a bright toy. His teeth closed on it. Ah! She'd left that damn kimono, that dirty pink kimono. She might have had the decency to take it with her, he thought. It would hang in the house like the corpse of their sick alliance. He would try to throw it away, but he would never be able to bring himself to move it. It would be like Kitty, soft and pliable, withal impervious. You couldn't move Kitty. You couldn't reach Kitty. There was nothing there to reach. He understood that perfectly. He had understood it all along. He reached to the wall for another biscuit, and with an effort pulled it out, nail and all. He carefully removed the nail from the center, wondering idly if he had eaten the nail with the first biscuit. Preposterous! He would have remembered. It was a huge nail. He felt his stomach. He must be very hungry. He considered, remembered yesterday he had had no dinner. It was the girls' day out and Kitty had lain in her room eating chocolate drops. She had said she felt smothery and couldn't bear having him near her. He had given George a bath and put him to bed, and then lain down on the couch, intending to rest a minute before getting his own dinner. There he had fallen asleep and awakened about 11 to find that there was nothing in the ice box except a spoonful of potato salad. This he had eaten, together with some chocolate drops that he found on Kitty's bureau. This morning he had breakfasted hurriedly downtown before going to the office, but at noon, beginning to worry about Kitty, he had decided to go home and take her out to lunch. After that there had been the note on his pillow. The pile of lingerie in the closet was gone, and she had left instructions for sending her trunk. He had never been so hungry, he thought. At 5 o'clock, when the visiting nurse tiptoed downstairs, he was sitting on the sofa staring at the carpet. "Mr. Cromwell?" "Yes." "Oh, Mrs. Curtain won't be able to see you at dinner. "She's not well. She told me to tell you that the cook will fix you something and that there's a spare bedroom."
"She's sick, you say?"
"She's lying down in her room. The consultation is just over."
Did they decide anything?"
"Yes," said the nurse softly. "Dr. Jewett says there's no hope. Mr. Curtain may live indefinitely, but he'll never see again, or move again, or think. He'll just breathe."
"Just breathe?"
"Yes."
For the first time the nurse noted that beside the writing desk, where she remembered that she had seen a line of dozen curious round objects she had vaguely imagined to be some exotic form of decoration, there was now only one. Where the others had been there was now a series of little nail holes. Harry followed her glance dazedly and then rose to his feet.
"I don't believe I'll stay. I believe there's a train."
She nodded. Harry picked up his hat.
"Good bye,"
she said pleasantly.
"Good bye,"
he answered, as though talking to himself, and evidently moved by some involuntary necessity. He paused on his way to the door, and she saw him pluck the last object from the wall and drop it into his pocket. Then he opened the screen door and, descending the porch steps, passed out of her sight. 5. After a while the coat of clean white paint on the Jeffrey Curtain house made a definite compromise with the suns of many Julys and showed its good faith by turning grey. It scaled. Huge peelings of very brittle old paint leaned over backward like aged men practising grotesque gymnastics, and finally dropped to a mouldy death in the overgrown grass beneath. The paint on the front pillars became streaky. The white ball was knocked off the left-hand doorpost. The green blinds darkened, then lost all pretense of colour. It began to be a house that was avoided by the tender-minded. Some church bought a lot diagonally opposite for a graveyard, and this, combined with the place where Mrs. Curtain stays with that living corpse, was enough to throw a ghostly aura over that quarter of the road. Not that she was left alone. Men and women came to see her, met her downtown where she went to do her marketing, brought her home in their cars, and came in for a moment to talk and rest, in the glamour that still played in her smile. But men who did not know her no longer followed her with admiring glances in the street. A diaphanous veil had come down over her beauty, destroying its vividness, yet bringing neither wrinkles nor fat. She acquired a character in the village. A group of little stories were told of her. How, when the country was frozen over one winter so that no wagons nor automobiles could travel, she taught herself to skate so that she could make quick time to the grocer and druggist and not leave Jeffrey alone for long. It was said that every night since his paralysis she slept in a small bed beside his bed, holding his hand. Jeffrey Curtain was spoken of as though he were already dead. As the years dropped by, those who had known him died or moved away. There were but half a dozen of the old crowd who had drunk cocktails together, called each other's wives by their first names, and thought that Jeff was about the wittiest and most talented fellow that Marlowe had ever known. How, to the casual visitor, he was merely the reason that Mrs. Curtain excused herself sometimes and hurried upstairs. He was a groan or a sharp cry borne to the silent parlour on the heavy air of a Sunday afternoon. He could not move. He was stone blind, dumb, and totally unconscious. All day he lay in his bed, except for a shift to his wheel chair every morning while she straightened the room. His paralysis was creeping slowly toward his heart. At first, for the first year, Roxanne had received the faintest answering pressure sometimes when she held his hand. Then it had gone, ceased one evening and never come back, and through 2 nights Roxanne lay wide-eyed, staring into the dark and wondering what had gone, what fraction of his soul had taken flight, what last grain of comprehension those shattered broken nerves still carried to the brain. After that hope died. Had it not been for her unceasing care, the last spark would have gone long before. Every morning she shaved and bathed him, shifted him with her own hands from bed to chair and back to bed. She was in his room constantly, bearing medicine, straightening a pillow, talking to him almost as one talks to a nearly human dog, without hope of response or appreciation, but with the dim persuasion of habit, a prayer when faith has gone. Not a few people, one celebrated nerve specialist among them, gave her a plain impression that it was futile to exercise so much care, that if Jeffrey had been conscious he would have wished to die,
that if his spirit were hovering in some wider air it would agree to no such sacrifice from her. It would fret only for the prison of its body to give it full release.
"But you see," she replied, shaking her head gently, "when I married Jeffrey it was until I ceased to love him."
"But," was protested in effect, "you can't love that."
"I can love what it once was. What else is there for me to do?"
The specialist shrugged his shoulders and went away, to say that Mrs. Curtain was a remarkable woman and just about as sweet as an angel, but, he added, it was a terrible pity.
There must be some man or a dozen just crazy to take care of her.
Casually, there were. Here and there some one began in hope and ended in reverence. There was no love in the woman except, strangely enough, for life, for the people in the world, from the tramp to whom she gave food she could ill afford to the butcher who sold her a cheap cut of steak across the meaty board. The other phase was sealed up somewhere in that expressionless mummy who lay with his face turned ever toward the light as mechanically as a compass needle and waited dumbly for the last wave to crash over his heart. After 11 years he died in the middle of a May night, when the scent of the syringa hung upon the window sill and a breeze wafted in the shrillings of the frogs and cicadas outside. Roxanne awoke at 2 and realized with a start she was alone in the house at last. 6. After that she sat on her weather-beaten porch through many afternoons, gazing down across the fields that undulated in a slow descent to the white and green town. She was wondering what she would do with her life. She was 36, handsome, strong, and free. The years had eaten up Jeffrey's insurance. She had reluctantly parted with the acres to right and left of her, and had even placed a small mortgage on the house. With her husband's death had come a great physical restlessness. She missed having to take care of him in the morning. She missed her rush to town and the brief and therefore accentuated neighborly meetings in the butcher's and grocer's. She missed the cooking for two, the preparation of delicate liquid food for him. One day, consumed with energy, she went out and spaded up the whole garden, a thing that had not been done for years. And she was alone at night in the room that had seen the glory of her marriage and then the pain. To meet Jeff again she went back in spirit to that wonderful year, that intense, passionate absorption and companionship, rather than looked forward to a problematical meeting hereafter. She awoke often to lie and wish for that presence beside her, inanimate yet breathing, still Jeff. One afternoon 6 months after his death she was sitting on the porch in a black dress which took away the faintest suggestion of plumpness from her figure. It was Indian summer, golden brown all about her, a hush broken by the sighing of leaves, westward a 4 o'clock sun dripping streaks of red and yellow over a flaming sky. Most of the birds had gone. Only a sparrow that had built itself a nest on the cornice of a pillar kept up an intermittent cheeping varied by occasional fluttering sallies overhead. Roxanne moved her chair to where she could watch him, and her mind idled drowsily on the bosom of the afternoon. Harry Cromwell was coming out from Chicago to dinner. Since his divorce over 8 years before he had been a frequent visitor. They had kept up what amounted to a tradition between them. When he arrived they would go to look at Jeff. Harry would sit down on the edge of the bed and in a hearty voice ask, "Well, Jeff, old man, how do you feel today?" Roxanne, standing beside, would look intently at Jeff, dreaming that some shadowy recognition of this former friend had passed across that broken mind. But the head, pale carven, would only move slowly in its sole gesture toward the light, as if something behind the blind eyes were groping for another light long since gone out. These visits stretched over 8 years. At Easter, Christmas, Thanksgiving, and on many a Sunday Harry had arrived, paid his call on Jeff, and then talked for a long while with Roxanne on the porch. He was devoted to her. He made no pretense of hiding, no attempt to deepen, this relation. She was his best friend as the mass of flesh on the bed there had been his best friend. She was peace, she was rest, she was the past. Of his own tragedy she alone knew. He had been at the funeral, but since then the company for which he worked had shifted him to the east, and only a business trip had brought him to the vicinity of Chicago. Roxanne had written to him come when he could. After a night in the city he had caught a train out. They shook hands and he helped her move 2 rockers together. "How's George?"
"He's fine, Roxanne. Seems to like school." "Of course it was the only thing to do, to send him." "Of course." "You miss him horribly, Harry?" "Yes, I do miss him. He's a funny boy." He talked a lot about George. Roxanne was interested. Harry must bring him out on his next vacation. She had only seen him once in her life, a child in dirty rompers. She left him with the newspaper while she prepared dinner. She had 4 chops to night, and some late vegetables from her own garden. She put it all on and then called him, and sitting down together they continued their talk about George. "If I had a child," she would say. Afterward, Harry having given her what slender advice he could about investments, they walked through the garden, pausing here and there to recognize what had once been a cement bench, or where the tennis court had lain. "Do you remember?" Then they were off on a flood of reminiscences. The day they had taken all the snapshots and Jeff had been photographed astride the calf, and the sketch Harry had made of Jeff and Roxanne lying sprawled in the grass, their heads almost touching. There was to have been a covered lattice connecting the barn studio with the house, so that Jeff could get there on wet days. The lattice had been started, but nothing remained except a broken triangular piece that still adhered to the house and resembled a battered chicken coop. "And those mint juleps." "And Jeff's notebook. Do you remember how we'd laugh, Harry, when we'd get it out of his pocket and read aloud a page of material? And how frantic he used to get?" "Wild. He was such a kid about his writing." They were both silent a moment, and then Harry said, "We were to have a place out here too, do you remember? We were to buy the adjoining 20 acres, and the parties we were going to have." Again there was a pause, broken this time by a low question from Roxanne. "Do you ever hear of her, Harry?" "Why, yes," he admitted placidly. "She's in Seattle. She's married again to a man named Horton, a sort of lumber king. He's a great deal older than she is, I believe." "And she's behaving?" "Yes, that is, I've heard so. She has everything, you see. Nothing much to do except dress up for this fellow at dinner time." "I see." Without effort he changed the subject. "Are you going to keep the house?" "I think so," she said, nodding. "I've lived here so long, Harry, it'd seem terrible to move. I thought of trained nursing, but of course that'd mean leaving. I've about decided to be a boarding house lady." "Live in one?" "No, keep one. Is there such an anomaly as a boarding house lady? Anyway, I'd have a negress and keep about 8 people in the summer, and 2 or 3 if I can get them in the winter. Of course I'll have to have the house repainted and gone over inside." Harry considered. "Roxanne, why, naturally you know best what you can do, but it does seem a shock, Roxanne. You came here as a bride." "Perhaps," she said, "that's why I don't mind remaining here as a boarding house lady." "I remember a certain batch of biscuits." "Oh, those biscuits!" she cried. "Still, from all I heard about the way you devoured them, they couldn't have been so bad. I was so low that day, yet somehow I laughed when the nurse told me about those biscuits." "I noticed that the 12 nail holes are still on the library wall where Jeff drove them." "Yes." It was getting very dark now. A crispness settled in the air. A little gust of wind sent down a last spray of leaves. Roxanne shivered slightly. "We'd better go in." He looked at his watch. "It's late. I've got to be leaving. I go east to morrow." "Must you?" They lingered for a moment just below the stoop, watching a moon that seemed full of snow float out of the distance where the lake lay. Summer was gone, and now Indian summer. The grass was cold and there was no mist and no dew. After he left she would go in and light the gas and close the shutters. He would go down the path and on to the village. To these two life had come quickly and gone, leaving not bitterness but pity, not disillusion but only pain. There was already enough moonlight when they shook hands for each to see the gathered kindness in the other's eyes. End of Section 11. Read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California, shaggybark.blogspot.com. Of Tales of the Jazz Age by F. Scott Fitzgerald. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Mr. Icky, the quintessence of quaintness in one act.
The scene is the exterior of a cottage in West Isaacshire on a desperately Arcadian afternoon in August. Mr. Icky, quaintly dressed in the costume of an Elizabethan peasant, is pottering and doddering among the pots and dods. He is an old man well past the prime of life, no longer young. From the fact that there is a burr in his speech, and that he has absent-mindedly put on his coat wrong side out, we surmise that he is either above or below the ordinary superficialities of life. Near him on the grass lies Peter, a little boy. Peter, of course, has his chin on his palm like the pictures of the young Sir Walter Raleigh. He has a complete set of features, including serious, sombre, even funereal, grey eyes, and radiates that alluring air of never having eaten food. This air can best be radiated during the afterglow of a beef dinner. He is looking at Mr. Icky, fascinated. Silence. The song of birds. Peter.
Often at night I sit at my window and regard the stars. Sometimes I think they're my stars.
Gravely.
I think I shall be a star some day.
Mr. Icky. Whimsically.
Yes, yes, yes. Peter. I know them all. Venus, Mars, Neptune, Gloria Swanson.
Mr. Icky.
I don't take no stock in astronomy. I've been thinking o' Lunnon, laddie, and calling to mind my daughter, who has gone for to be a typewriter.
He sighs.
Peter. I liked Ulsa, Mr. Icky. She was so plump, so round, so buxom.
Mr. Icky.
Not worth the paper she was padded with, laddie.
He stumbles over a pile of pots and dods. Peter.
How is your asthma, Mr. Icky?
Mr. Icky.
Worse, thank God. Gloomily. I'm 100 years old. I'm getting brittle.
Peter.
I suppose life has been pretty tame since you gave up petty arson.
Mr. Icky.
Yes, yes. You see, Peter, laddie, when I was 50 I reformed once in prison.
Peter.
You went wrong again?
Mr. Icky.
Worse than that. The week before my term expired they insisted on transferring to me the glands of a healthy young prisoner they were executing.
Peter.
And it renovated you?
Mr. Icky.
Renovated me? It put the old Nick back into me. This young criminal was evidently a suburban burglar and a kleptomaniac. What was a little playful arson in comparison?
Peter. Awed.
How ghastly. Science is the bunk.
Mr. Icky, sighing.
I got him pretty well subdued now. 'Tisn't everyone who has to tire out 2 sets of glands in his lifetime. I wouldn't take another set for all the animal spirits in an orphan asylum.
Peter, considering.
I shouldn't think you'd object to a nice quiet old clergyman's set.
Mr. Icky.
Clergymen haven't got glands. They have souls.
There is a low, sonorous honking off stage to indicate that a large motor car has stopped in the immediate vicinity. Then a young man, handsomely attired in a dress suit and a patent leather silk hat, comes on to the stage. He is very mundane. His contrast to the spirituality of the other two is observable as far back as the first row of the balcony. This is Rodney Devine. Devine. I'm looking for Ulsa Icky. Mr. Icky rises and stands tremulously between 2 dods. Mr. Icky.
My daughter is in London.
Devine. She has left London. She is coming here. I have followed her. He reaches into the little mother of pearl satchel that hangs at his side for cigarettes. He selects one and, scratching a match, touches it to the cigarette. The cigarette instantly lights. Devine. I shall wait. He waits. Several hours pass. There is no sound except an occasional cackle or hiss from the dods as they quarrel among themselves. Several songs can be introduced here, or some card tricks by Devine, or a tumbling act as desired. Devine. It's very quiet here. Mr. Icky.
Yes, very quiet.
Suddenly a loudly dressed girl appears. She is very worldly. It is Ulsa Icky. On her is one of those shapeless faces peculiar to early Italian painting. Ulsa, in a coarse, worldly voice.
Father, here I am. Ulsa did what?
Mr. Icky, tremulously.
Ulsa, little Ulsa.
They embrace each other's torsos. Mr. Icky, hopefully.
You're coming back to help with the ploughing?
Ulsa, sullenly.
No, father. Ploughing's such a bather. I'd rather not.
Though her accent is broad, the content of her speech is sweet and clean. Divine, conciliatingly. See here, Ulsa, let's come to an understanding. He advances toward her with the graceful, even stride that made him captain of the striding team at Cambridge. Ulsa.
You will say it would be Jack?
Mr. Icky.
What does she mean?
Divine, kindly. My dear, of course it would be Jack. It couldn't be Frank. Mr. Icky.
Frank who?
Ulsa.
It would be Frank.
Some risque joke can be introduced here. Mr. Icky, whimsically.
No good fighting, no good fighting.
Divine, reaching out to stroke her arm with the powerful movement that made him stroke of the crew at Oxford. You'd better marry me. Ulsa, scornfully.
Why, they wouldn't let me in through the servants' entrance of your house.
Divine, angrily. They wouldn't. Never fear. You shall come in through the mistress' entrance. Ulsa.
Sir.
Divine, in confusion. I beg your pardon. You know what I mean. Mr. Icky, aching with whimsy.
You want to marry my little Ulsa?
Divine. I do. Mr. Icky.
Your record is clean?
Divine. Excellent. I have the best constitution in the world. Ulsa.
And the worst bylaws?
Divine. At Eton I was a member at Pop. At Rugby I belonged to Nearbeer. As a younger son I was destined for the police force. Mr. Icky.
Skip that. Have you money?
Divine. Wads of it. I should expect Ulsa to go downtown in sections every morning, in 2 Rolls Royces. I have also a kiddie car and a converted tank. I have seats at the opera. Ulsa, sullenly.
I can't sleep except in a box, and I've heard that you are cashiered from your club.
Mr. Icky.
A cashier?
Divine, hanging his head. I was cashiered. Ulsa.
What for?
Divine, almost inaudibly. I hid the polo balls one day for a joke. Mr. Icky.
Is your mind in good shape?
Divine, gloomily. Fair. After all, what is brilliance? Merely the tact to sow when no one is looking and reap when everyone is. Mr. Icky.
Be careful. I will not marry my daughter to an epigram.
Divine, more gloomily. I assure you I'm a mere platitude. I often descend to the level of an innate idea. Ulsa, dully.
None of what you're saying matters. I can't marry a man who thinks it would be Jack. Why, Frank would.
Divine, interrupting. Nonsense. Ulsa, emphatically.
You're a fool.
Mr. Icky.
Tut, tut. One should not judge. Charity, my girl. What was it Nero said? With malice toward none and charity toward all.
Peter. That wasn't Nero. That was John Drinkwater. Mr. Icky.
Come, who is this Frank? Who is Jack?
Divine, morosely. Gotch. Ulsa.
Dempsey.
Divine. We were arguing that if they were deadly enemies and locked in a room together, which one would come out alive. Now I claimed that Jack Dempsey would take one. Ulsa, angrily.
Rot! He wouldn't have a...
Divine, quickly. You win. Ulsa.
Then I love you again.
Mr. Icky.
So I'm going to lose my little daughter?
Ulsa.
You still got a house full of children.
Charles, Ulsa's brother, coming out of the cottage. He is dressed as if to go to sea. A coil of rope is slung about his shoulder and an anchor is hanging from his neck. Charles, not seeing them. I'm going to sea, I'm going to sea. His voice is triumphant. Mr. Icky, sadly.
You went to sea long ago.
Charles. I've been reading Conrad. Peter, dreamily. Conrad. Ah, 2 years before the mast by Henry James. Charles. What? Peter. Walter Pater's version of Robinson Crusoe. Charles, to his father. I can't stay here and rot with you. I want to live my life. I want to hunt eels. Mr. Icky.
I will be here when you come back.
Charles, contemptuously. Why, the worms are licking their chops already when they hear your name. It will be noticed that some of the characters have not spoken for some time. It will improve the technique if they can be rendering a spirited saxophone number. Mr. Icky, mournfully.
These vales, these hills, these McCormick harvesters, they mean nothing to my children. I understand.
Charles, more gently.
Then you'll think of me kindly, feyther. To understand is to forgive.
Mr. Icky.
No, no, we never forgive those we can understand. We can only forgive those who wound us for no reason at all.
Charles, impatiently.
I'm so beastly sick of your human nature line, and anyway, I hate the hours around here.
Several dozen more of Mr. Icky's children trip out of the house, trip over the grass, and trip over the pots and dods. They are muttering, "We are going away," and "We're leaving you." Mr. Icky, his heart breaking.
They're all deserting me. I've been too kind. Spare the rod and spoil the fun. Oh, for the glands of a Bismarck.
There is a honking outside, probably Divine's chauffeur growing impatient for his master. Mr. Icky, in misery.
They do not love the soil. They have been faithless to the great potato tradition.
He picks up a handful of soil passionately and rubs it on his bald head. Hair sprouts.
Oh, Wordsworth, Wordsworth, how true you spoke. No motion has she now, no force. She does not hear or feel, rolled around on earth's diurnal course in someone's Oldsmobile.
They all groan and, shouting "Life" and "Jazz," move slowly toward the wings. Charles.
Back to the soil. Yes, I've been trying to turn my back to the soil for 10 years.
Another child.
The farmers may be the backbone of the country, but who wants to be a backbone?
Another child.
I care not who hoes the lettuce of my country if I can eat the salad.
All. Life, psychic research, jazz. Mr. Icky, struggling with himself.
I must be quaint. That's all there is. It's not life that counts, it's the quaintness you bring to it.
All. We're going to slide down the Riviera. We've got tickets for Piccadilly Circus. Life, jazz. Mr. Icky.
Wait, let me read to you from the Bible. Let me open it at random. One always finds something that bears on the situation.
He finds a Bible lying in one of the dods, and opening it at random begins to read.
Ahab, Estemo, and Anim, Gosen, and Olan, and Gilo, 11 cities and their villages. Arab, and Ruma, and Esau.
Charles, cruelly.
Buy 10 more rings and try again.
Mr. Icky, trying again.
How beautiful art thou, my love, how beautiful art thou. Thy eyes are dove's eyes, besides what is hid within. Thy hair is as flocks of goats which come up from Mount Galad. Rather a coarse passage.
His children laugh at him rudely, shouting, "Jazz!" and "All life is primarily suggestive." Mr. Icky, despondently.
It won't work today.
Hopefully.
Maybe it's damp.
He feels it.
Yes, it's damp. There was water in the dod. It won't work.
All. It's damp. It won't work. Jazz. One of the children.
Come, we must catch the 6:30.
Any other cue may be inserted here. Mr. Icky.
Goodbye.
They all go out. Mr. Icky is left alone. He sighs, and walking over to the cottage steps, lies down and closes his eyes. Twilight has come down, and the stage is flooded with such light as never was on land or sea. There is no sound except a sheep herder's wife in the distance, playing an aria from Beethoven's 10th Symphony on a mouth organ. The great white and grey moths swoop down and light on the old man until he is completely covered by them, but he does not stir. The curtain goes up and down several times to denote the lapse of several minutes. A good comedy effect can be obtained by having Mr. Icky cling to the curtain and go up and down with it. Fireflies or fairies on wires can also be introduced at this point. Then Peter appears, a look of almost imbecile sweetness on his face. In his hand he clutches something and from time to time glances at it in a transport of ecstasy. After a struggle with himself, he lays it on the old man's body and then quietly withdraws. The moths chatter among themselves and then scurry away in sudden fright, and as night deepens there still sparkles there, small, white and round, breathing a subtle perfume to the West Isaacsshire breeze, Peter's gift of love, a moth ball. The play can end at this point, or can go on indefinitely. End of Section 12, read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California, shaggybark.blogspot.com. Tales of the Jazz Age by F. Scott Fitzgerald. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Jemina, the Mountain Girl. This don't pretend to be literature. This is just a tale for red-blooded folks who want a story, and not just a lot of psychological stuff or analysis. Boy, you'll love it. Read it here. See it in the movies. Play it on the phonograph. Run it through the sewing machine. A wild thing. It was night in the mountains of Kentucky. Wild hills rose on all sides. Swift mountain streams flowed rapidly up and down the mountains. Jemina Tantrum was down at the stream, brewing whiskey at the family still. She was a typical mountain girl. Her feet were bare. Her hands, large and powerful, hung down below her knees. Her face showed the ravages of work. Although but 16, she had for over a dozen years been supporting her aged pappy and mappy by brewing mountain whiskey. From time to time she would pause in her task, and filling a dipper full of the pure, invigorating liquid, would drain it off, then pursue her work with renewed vigor. She would place the rye in the vat, thresh it out with her feet, and in 20 minutes the completed product would be turned out. A sudden cry made her pause in the act of draining a dipper and look up. "Hello," said a man. It came from a man clad in hunting boots reaching to his neck, who had emerged. "Can you tell me the way to the Tantrum's cabin?"
"Are you uns from the settlements down thar?"
She pointed her hand down to the bottom of the hill, where Louisville lay. She had never been there, but once before she was born her great-grandfather, old Gore Tantrum, had gone into the settlements in the company of 2 marshals, and had never come back. So the Tantrums from generation to generation had learned to dread civilization. The man was amused. He laughed a light, tinkling laugh, the laugh of a Philadelphian. Something in the ring of it thrilled her. She drank off another dipper of whiskey. "Where is Mr. Tantrum, little girl?" he asked, not without kindness. She raised her foot and pointed her big toe toward the woods.
"Thar in the cabing, behind those thar pines. Old Tantrum air my old man."
The man from the settlements thanked her and strode off. He was fairly vibrant with youth and personality. As he walked along, he whistled and sang and turned handsprings and flapjacks, breathing in the fresh, cool air of the mountains. The air around the still was like wine. Jemina Tantrum watched him entranced. No one like him had ever come into her life before. She sat down on the grass and counted her toes. She counted 11. She had learned arithmetic in the mountain school. A mountain feud. 10 years before, a lady from the settlements had opened a school on the mountain. Jemina had no money, but she had paid her way in whiskey, bringing a pail full to school every morning and leaving it on Miss Lafarge's desk. Miss Lafarge had died of delirium tremens after a year's teaching, and so Jemina's education had stopped. Across the still stream, still another still was standing. It was that of the Doldrums. The Doldrums and the Tantrums never exchanged calls. They hated each other. 50 years before, old Jem Doldrum and old Jem Tantrum had quarrelled in the Tantrum cabin over a game of slapjack. Jem Doldrum had thrown the king of hearts in Jem Tantrum's face, and old Tantrum, enraged, had felled old Doldrum with the 9 of diamonds. Other Doldrums and Tantrums had joined in, and the little cabin was soon filled with flying cards. Harstrum Doldrum, one of the younger Doldrums, lay stretched on the floor, writhing in agony, the ace of hearts crammed down his throat. Jem Tantrum, standing in the doorway, ran through suit after suit, his face alight with fiendish hatred. Old Mappy Tantrum stood on the table, wetting down the Doldrums with hot whiskey. Old Heck Doldrum, having finally run out of trumps, was backed out of the cabin, striking left and right with his tobacco pouch, and gathering around him the rest of his clan. They mounted their steers and galloped furiously home. That night old man Doldrum and his sons, vowing vengeance, had returned, put a tick-tock on the Tantrum window, stuck a pin in the doorbell, and beaten a retreat. A week later the Tantrums had put cod liver oil in the Doldrums' still, and so from year to year the feud had continued, first one family being entirely wiped out, then the other. The birth of love. Every day little Jemina worked the still on her side of the stream, and Bosco Doldrum worked the still on his side. Sometimes, with automatic inherited hatred, the feudists would throw whiskey at each other, and Jemina would come home smelling like a French table d'hôte. But now Jemina was too thoughtful to look across the stream. How wonderful the stranger had been, and how oddly he was dressed! In her innocent way, she had never believed that there were any civilized settlements at all, and she had put the belief in them down to the credulity of the mountain people. She turned to go up to the cabin, and as she turned, something struck her in the neck. It was a sponge thrown by Bosco Doldrum, a sponge soaked in whiskey from his still on the other side of the stream. "Hi there, Bosco Doldrum," she shouted in her deep bass voice. "Yo, Jemina Tantrum. Gosh ding yo," he returned. She continued her way to the cabin. The stranger was talking to her father. Gold had been discovered on the Tantrum land, and the stranger, Edgar Edison, was trying to buy the land for a song. He was considering what song to offer. She sat upon her hands and watched him. He was wonderful. When he talked, his lips moved. She sat upon the stove and watched him. Suddenly there came a blood-curdling scream. The Tantrums rushed to the windows. It was the Doldrums. They had hitched their steers to trees and concealed themselves behind the bushes and flowers, and soon a perfect rattle of stones and bricks beat against the windows, bending them inward. "Father, father!" shrieked Jemina. Her father took down his slingshot from his slingshot rack on the wall and ran his hand lovingly over the elastic band. He stepped to a loophole. Old Mappy Tantrum stepped to the coal hole. A mountain battle. The stranger was aroused at last. Furious to get at the Doldrums, he tried to escape from the house by crawling up the chimney. Then he thought there might be a door under the bed, but Jemina told him there was not. He hunted for doors under the beds and sofas, but each time Jemina pulled him out and told him there were no doors there. Furious with anger, he beat upon the door and hollered at the Doldrums. They did not answer him, but kept up their fusillade of bricks and stones against the window. Old Pappy Tantrum knew that just as soon as they were able to effect an aperture, they would pour in and the fight would be over. Then old Heck Doldrum, foaming at the mouth and expectorating on the ground left and right, led the attack. The terrific slingshots of Pappy Tantrum had not been without their effect. A master shot had disabled one Doldrum, and another Doldrum, shot almost incessantly through the abdomen, fought feebly on. Nearer and nearer they approached the house. "We must fly!" shouted the stranger to Jemina. "I will sacrifice myself and bear you away." "No!" shouted Pappy Tantrum, his face begrimed. "You stay here and fit on. I will bar Jemina away. I will bar Mappy away. I will bar myself away." The man from the settlements, pale and trembling with anger, turned to Ham Tantrum, who stood at the door throwing loophole after loophole at the advancing Doldrums. "Will you cover the retreat?" But Ham said that he too had Tantrums to bear away, but that he would leave himself here to help the stranger cover the retreat, if he could think of a way of doing it. Soon smoke began to filter through the door and ceiling. Shem Doldrum had come up and touched a match to old Japhet Tantrum's breath as he leaned from a loophole, and the alcoholic flames shot up on all sides. The whiskey in the bathtub caught fire. The walls began to fall in. Jemina and the man from the settlements looked at each other. "Jemina," he whispered. "Stranger," she answered. "We will die together," he said. "If we had lived, I would have taken you to the city and married you. With your ability to hold liquor, your social success could have been assured." She caressed him idly for a moment, counting her toes softly to herself. The smoke grew thicker. Her left leg was on fire. She was a human alcohol lamp. Their lips met in one long kiss, and then a wall fell on them and blotted them out, as one. When the Doldrums burst through the ring of flame, they found them dead where they had fallen, their arms about each other. Old Jem Doldrum was moved. He took off his hat. He filled it with whiskey and drank it off. "They are dead," he said slowly. "They hankered after each other. The fit is over now. We must not part them." So they threw them together into the stream, and the two splashes they made were as one. End of Section 13. End of Tales of the Jazz Age by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California, shaggybark.blogspot.com.